Our hero woke up in an unfamiliar place and simply could not understand where he was. Holding his head and looking around, he could not understand what had happened to him and whether it was real. A window appeared in front of him with the words, "His name is Lee," written on it, and he looked at his hand from the past, which had never practiced martial arts. It also said that our hero had started his first paragraph, and Lee realized that this was a status window. Then, an inscription appeared in front of him about what he had just done, followed by a warning that the world was collapsing. The window lit up red, and a warning appeared that the genre of the novel was fantasy, and that he did not have a status window. After that, the world surrounding Li Huan simply exploded into atoms in an instant, and it was the first death of a character. Soon he recovered in the world, and thought that he had no way of knowing the rules of this world. He recovered in the same room, and quickly realized this. He also realized that this was a place from a novel, where his actions and words affect reality. After this thought, he decided to think about what had happened to him in the last few minutes. Getting out of bed, Li Huan realized that the explosion occurred after he opened the status window. Inside the novel that someone had started writing, Li regressed for some reason. He continued to think and realized that he had regressed into this body. Li knew that this had happened because he was not in his usual body. He used to be an ordinary office worker with little experience in writing novels. Remembering this, he decided that now he needed to finally look at his face and find out what he looked like. Looking at his new self in the mirror, he thought that the genre of his novel should be romance, since he was so handsome. However, he was concerned that just one sentence from him could destroy the world, and he realized that he was the main character in this novel. Realizing that he was the main character, Lee decided that he could fulfill all his desires here, and he thought that they sounded like those of a main character. After that, a window appeared in front of him saying that Lee had completed the prologue. After that, a message appeared saying that the author had decided on the title of the novel. It was The King of Fists, interested only in himself. Immediately, a man appeared in the room and said that he had a good feeling about this. He said that people usually called him God, but in this particular case, he was the author of the novel. The author added that this was precisely why he had transported our hero into the world of his work. He explained that his web novel was a little different from what people usually write. Lee replied that he knew a little about novel and advised him to change the title because it was very important, and the author agreed to consider it. The author added that he would not make Lee work for free, and if his work was chosen as the winner, he would grant him any wish. In addition, Lee could stay in this world forever, so he had only one condition: to live the life of the real main character. Lee couldn't believe that he was being asked to live the life of the main character, because that was his dream, since he had escaped from his gray, everyday life. After that, he immediately asked what the continuation of his story would be, but the author disappeared and said they would discuss it later. And now our hero was left alone in the room, thinking about what to do next. Soon he came to his senses and thanked the author for the role of the main character. Deciding that the prologue to his story was enough, he put on his jacket and decided to go for a walk. Immediately after that, a window appeared behind him with a caption stating that the serialization in the modern fantasy genre had begun. Lee couldn't believe that God had started the serialization so quickly, given that he only had a prologue and some settings. After reading the prologue, Lee realized that God did not have a clear plan for the future of this novel. He assumed that this was how it had worked before, but you couldn't call yourself an author without knowing the current trends. And even that did not minimize the fact that our hero had regressed into the main character. Before leaving the house, he decided to find out what martial arts his character had studied before. He didn't expect anything grand, but he was shown that he had practiced the divine art of the heavenly demon. Lee absolutely did not expect to receive such a powerful, supreme martial art. It included learning breathing techniques, palm control, stepping, and more. Mastering even one of these techniques could make him a master, but mastering all of them would allow him to go beyond the limits of reasonable strength. The information about it stayed in Lee's mind, and now he understood why his character was so beautiful. A technique with 12 pressure points was added to him, and it was created after the battle with the Zodiacs in the Heavenly Kingdom. In addition, 3 breathing techniques and demon martial arts improvement techniques were added. Lee was afraid that his plot was moving too fast, and that he would not be able to learn so much at once. He couldn't believe that everything around him was like a cheat code, and he was simply enveloped in martial arts and breathing technique. Lee learned the art of the Heavenly Demon, and 3 breathing techniques that perfected it. Our hero felt that he could use them, but he needed to understand on whom. At that moment, someone suddenly started banging on his door and shouting for him to open it. Lee didn't understand what was happening and why someone was banging on his door after he thought about the fight. The author told him that he had only imagined a random person and the rest was up to Lee. Lee was a little disappointed with this decision, even though everyone had their own writing style, but this was too much. At that very moment, a huge guy in a Hawaiian shirt burst into his apartment and told Lee that the password on the door should be more complicated than 4 zeros. The guy noticed that Lee was looking at him strangely and probably had been having fun on his own. Lee didn't understand why the guy was talking such nonsense, but decided that he was the perfect candidate to test his strength. And since the answer that a fight was needed was obvious, our hero didn't wait long and told him that he had come just in time. Lee saw that his name was Quan and that his job was to take money from Lee, and besides that, he was quite stupid. So, to the puzzled Quan, Lee said that he wanted to test his new body. Quan was wildly angered by these words and immediately rushed at Lee with his fists. But Lee dodged his punch quite easily and even wondered why he was so slow. Quan himself was surprised that Lee dodged the punch, and our hero replied that it was easier than easy. He told Quan that he was very slow, while thinking to himself that he was simply the main character of the novel. These words made the rage inside Quan flare up again, and he lunged at Lee once more. Then, in an instant, Lee's life flashed before his eyes, and our hero saw Lee's memories before his regression. Now, how his character used his powers came to mind, and his body moved according to those memories. As a result, our hero used some kind of special technique, and his blows were illuminated by a purple light. After this blow, Lee's arm ached a little, and Quan was lying by the door. Leaning over him, Lee noted that no one had taught Quan manners, so he would help him. Lee understood that Quan didn't understand anything about what was going on around him. In the end, our hero simply added that you can't trust only your eyes. After all, in their world, there was no such thing as justice, and Lee said this as the main character. At that moment, the author appeared and noted that this was perfect for the main character. Lee said that the author had come at the right time and asked how the main character should use his powers, since he was selfish but super strong. He wanted to know at least roughly what his character would do in the future, but the author looked away and did not answer. After that, he replied that Lee would take revenge for being sent to the other world before the regression, and that revenge was his ultimate goal. Lee said that this was not in the plot, to which the author replied that he had come up with it on the spot. This made our hero nervous, and he asked the author who he would need to take revenge on. The author asked why Lee wanted to know everything so quickly, and noted that the plot should develop gradually, so he would not tell him. Our hero realized that the author simply had not thought the plot through yet. God noted that this time, everything would be different, and Lee replied anxiously that God had not yet figured out how it would be different. The author reminded him that Lee was the main character, and that he would create a story where he was the main character together with the author. Our hero listened carefully to these words, and then the author asked if it sounded tempting. Lee couldn't believe that he would be able to write a novel together with the author and influence his own life. This was wonderful news for him, meaning that he would be able to fulfill his dream. The author disappeared, and Quan woke up. Lee asked him if he had stolen 3,000 from him, and if he wanted to return 30,000 with interest. Quan knelt down in horror and asked our hero where he could get that much money, to which Lee coolly replied that Quan could simply earn it. Lee noted that even goblin loan sharks allow thugs to borrow money, and Quan couldn't understand how he knew that. After that, Quan quickly got up and fled the apartment, and our hero called him a coward. The author noted that goblins in the world of martial arts are unusual and interesting, so he added the fantasy genre to the novel. After that, windows began to appear about the addition of different races of elves, orcs, goblins, and gnomes. Lee realized that it really worked, and that what he said was appearing in the world. There was even a window saying that the author was inspired and decided to mix different worlds. He decided that for some reason, the martial arts world and the fantasy world had mixed together because of someone. This happened at the end of the Second World Battle, and that is why history changed. All this explained the existence of fantasy races and the influence of martial arts on the world. The author was struck by inspiration and was very happy about it, even though he thought it was too much. But he told himself that it was the right decision to add so many different forces to the world. It turned out that at the end of the battle, due to an incident in space, the worlds collided, and this was called the collision of worlds, and Lee liked this interpretation. Thanks to this, he didn't have to explain why the main character was skilled in martial arts, and he could finally begin to explore the world created by him and the author. Next, our hero was shown a notification that the author had finished writing the last paragraph, and the novel was 100% complete. And now Lee could see with his own eyes what a world where modernity and fantasy coexist looks like. And Lee realized that the world was slowly beginning to match his surroundings. He came across a picture advertising a gold bank card with no interest and a goblin on it. And then our hero realized that everything he had said to the author had actually come true. Lee set himself the task of making his body stronger for martial arts, and thought about where to go with it. Then he realized that depending on his words and thoughts, old memories of Li Huan came to mind. After that, they immediately became part of the personality of the new character and our hero, and he found the right place for himself. After all, when he imagined a place in his head, it became his surroundings and then reality. In this way, he quickly found the building of the Muram Federation, which was organized after the conclusion of an alliance between the factions. While he was standing at its entrance, the Muram Agency in Korea and the nation of the Golden Spring Kingdom were added to the world. In the future, Lee wanted to try to steer the country's history in a safer direction. At that moment, the female administrator asked Lee if she could help him with anything. Lee realized that she could, and asked her for a minute, because he knew he had to show her one thing. That thing was an application because he wanted to register as a martial arts master. A couple of minutes later, his application was approved, and Lee realized that he would become the strongest character in the game, as the title suggests. After that, he was informed that he could proceed to the interview. There, he was tested by Ju Wan, who said that Lee had completed his task. However, Ju Wan was confused that Lee could not name his clan or his teacher. Even though he didn't know them, he said that they should be proud of such a talented student as Lee. He said that after the collision of worlds, there was chaos, and many people couldn't get used to the new world. That's why they left it to fight alone. Such people were called righteous. Ju Wan said that now Lee was one of them, and he could keep his citizenship or become part of the Muram Federation. Lee thanked Ju Wan for his high opinion of him, even though he thought he talked too much. After that, Lee said that there was a real reason why he had come, and he wanted to talk to the head of the Dragon Sword clan. Ju Wan asked how Lee knew about his clan, and this piqued the old man's interest. Lee knew that something was about to happen, and said that the clan must have something. That something was the main character's weapon before his regression, and Lee said that it was the first heavenly decree about the primordial fire. Immediately, this weapon was added to the world lore, and it was said that this treasure contained the soul of a heavenly demon, and Ju Wan's role was upgraded. A window immediately popped up saying that Ju Wan was now a secondary character. After that, with some hesitation, Lee said that he had come to take the treasure as its owner. With that, he decided that his role was over, and that the decision was now up to the world. Ju Wan asked again if our hero had said that he was the rightful owner of the treasure, and how he dared to speak of it that way. He adjusted his tie, and said he didn't know why Lee thought he could take their priceless treasure. Before doing anything, Ju Wan asked Lee to explain himself, and burst into blue flame. Lee was impressed by this, and thought that Ju Wan was no different from an ordinary killer, even though everything was going according to his plan. Then he thought that Ju Wan should let him take what was his, and he summoned a purple light, adding the rabbit and dragon techniques to his arsenal. His sensitivity increased because he had acquired the 12-point technique of the great heavenly demon. In addition to all this, our hero's key technique had improved. Lee felt that all these techniques were quite unstable, and even though he still had 10 left, the power of 2 was incredible. Ju Wan called Lee a poor soul because he used ki, and in his opinion, Lee wanted to go to the other world. He asked who sent Lee, and Lee thought that he did not look like someone who wanted to go to the other world. When Lee did not answer, Ju Wan said that in that case, he would reveal the dark secrets of our hero himself, and attacked him. It was a pretty powerful and fast attack, but our hero still managed to dodge it. Lee couldn't figure out if this was Ju Wan's real power, and was grateful that he had increased his sensitivity. Ju Wan noted that Lee managed to dodge the attack of 1,000 beasts, and was impressed by that. This technique was considered more complex than the heavenly sword, and therefore the author greatly enjoyed watching their battle. Lee thought it would be better if the author did not watch, but helped him deal with Ju Wan, because he was in danger. But the author did not answer him, and Lee had to fend off his attacks for some time. Lee couldn't understand that the person in front of him now was the same as before, because he was different from the one in his memories. He clearly felt that something had changed, because his skills were clearly not those of the second generation. Lee struck a blow, and thought that whoever Ju Wan was, he had to give him the treasure. Ju Wan's power changed, and he launched a powerful attack on Lee from above. It turned out that Ju Wan was pretending, and was a first-generation master who appeared after the collision of worlds. He was the Dragon Sword, and Lee was afraid that the author would not help him, because the difficulty of the battle had increased significantly. And he attacked our hero again, and Lee was worried that Ju Wan would not miss. He had the feeling that thousands of shapeless blades were piercing him. Lee couldn't think about what his character Li Huan was like in this world before, so he used pure instinct. He began to utter certain words out of inertia, and summoned the 7th form. As a result, A powerful attack threw Ju-won against the wall. Lee put his whole self into it when he thought he would win, but this power was very strong. He realized that he was beating an ordinary man who was trying to protect his clan's treasure. It was obvious that the comments on the novel would be negative, because he was acting like a villain. While he was thinking about this, Ju-won said that he had the first heavenly decree about the primordial fire. He looked at our hero and added that Lee would not get it just like that, because he would defend it, even at the cost of his life. Ju-won said that Lee was not the first to want to take the first heavenly decree for himself. Our hero realized that he looked like a villain, and urgently needed to come up with something so that he would not look like one. He put his hand on Ju-won and asked why he wanted to fight when his body was so damaged. Lee said kindly that Ji-won must have had a very difficult journey, and that what was a treasure for Ji-won was poison for Lee. He added that the Dragon Sword clan no longer needed to carry such a heavy burden. The key between the heavenly demon and the Buddha, and the absolute power of the victor, was the heavenly demon's energy indicator, the lotus breath technique. After this thought, a small fireball rose from Ji-won's back. The ball rose above Lee's head, and it was written that if a person used the lotus breath, they would suffer from heat 4 times a year. And the only way to extract the first heavenly decree from the body is to apply the lotus breath technique. And now our hero saw with his own eyes the first heavenly decree about the primordial fire. And this very fireball flew sharply towards Lee and flew straight into his chest. Our hero felt his whole body on fire. He saw a novel, and it was written that the energy of fire had poured into Lee. This energy had been combined with key training techniques for 60 years, and it was called the Flaming Heavens. Looking at his hands in the flames, Lee noted that he could not have imagined that the Flaming Heavens were like this. Ju-won said that he bowed before the heavenly demon because his clan's wish had finally come true, and he thought he would be able to leave in peace. He bowed before our hero, and then Lee heard for the first time that he was called a heavenly demon, and felt like the main character of this story. After a while, Ju gave him the best pass he could provide. Lee saw that according to it, he was now an advanced martial arts master. Ju said that Lee's rank was higher, but with this pass, he could go anywhere. Looking at Ju-won, our hero thanked him for his concern and help. He replied that he had found something else that Lee might need as a place to train. He himself had gone to this place every time he felt flashes of heat from the primordial fire, but now it was just a house to live in. After that, Ju-won said that Lee could turn to him for help at any convenient time. He bowed to our hero and noted that he would do everything he could to help him. Leaving the Federation, Lee realized that he had a treasure and that he had accumulated some of the key he needed. In addition, he understood that it was time to enter the main plot of the novel. Therefore, he turned to the author and asked him what they would do with the next story, because the time had come for a real battle. And Lee's opponents in this situation had to be quite strong. The writer was pleased that his main character was so eager for the next story, and asked him to give him some time. Lee himself also felt that the author was happy, and it was indeed interesting. Lee was also eagerly awaiting the next chapter. At that moment, he realized that a race of demons and another world had been added, and Lee was surprised that such a thing was possible in the plot. The other world was a location that had been expanding since the day of the collision, and it was inhabited by demons, creatures that did not live in Murim and the fantasy world. Knowing that they did not exist in his world, Lee assumed that the demon's dimension was colliding with his own. Our hero pointed out to the author that the narrative was becoming too dense, and the author began to explain this process in detail. The tedious explanation gave Lee a headache from the multitude of terms, and he asked the author to stop. God appeared and asked Lee not to worry, because his narrative was flowing very smoothly. But our hero noted that the problem was not that, but the large amount of information. In addition, everything that could not be realized was crammed into the plot. And although this was good for motivation, nothing could be done about it. And besides, the main narrative had not yet begun to move forward. Nevertheless, Lee thought that since God was writing it, he would be able to deal with these shortcomings on his own. But on the other hand, he was afraid that if he left everything to God, the novel would fail and everything would be in vain. But on the other hand, he was afraid that if he left everything to God, the novel would fail and everything would be in vain. Our hero couldn't afford to miss such a wonderful opportunity. So he turned to the author and told him that he had come up with a wonderful setting and was excellent at describing the details. And after the author received the plot lines, Lee asked if he wanted the martial arts master Lee to solve all the problems with the other world. This could become the focus of their story, and here the author thought about this proposal for a moment. God replied that Lee knew him very well, because that was exactly what he wanted to write. Lee, of course, understood that this was a lie. A couple of minutes later, it was announced on the street that they had lost contact with the 7 Phantoms and Green Sword teams at the Piano Academy a week later. The Security Bureau held a conference at which it asked for any help and temporarily lifted the entry restrictions. Additionally, it was reported that a demon baron named Savage was present, which was exactly what Lee wanted. Our hero realized that his time to shine had finally come, and he went to the Harem Piano Academy. When he approached the place, it was fenced off, and the guards said it was a dangerous area. Our hero did not understand how a demon could appear in such a crowded place. But still, looking at the building, Lee realized that this fight would most likely be easy for him. He showed the guard his high-ranking pass, just as he asked Lee to step aside. In the end, our hero passed, and the guard was shocked that such a young guy was an advanced martial arts master. Passing by, Lee wondered what he could do to make the story more interesting, and thought of connecting it with revenge. At that moment, a girl approached him and asked him to show her his pass again. Our hero was surprised and asked if there was a problem, but she wanted to double-check. Lee thought something was fishy, but he gave her the pass anyway. That's how he found out that her name was Shin, and that she worked in the office, although she didn't look like the main character. Then the author intervened, and said that he decided they needed another character in the story, and added her. Shin said that Lee's pass had been issued today, and that Lee probably hadn't cleared his entry with management, to which Lee replied that entry was free. Shin added that confirmation was a formal procedure, and thanked Lee for coming to help. She offered to show him the equipment before he entered the academy, and also to conduct a briefing. Shin explained that 6 teams had entered at first, but only 2 Phantoms and a Green Sword remained. If Lee went alone and realized it was too dangerous, he would have to turn back. At that moment, our hero discovered a beautiful pistol next to him. Shin noted that since he was a martial arts master, he should look for a sword next to the pistols. But our hero wanted a solid metal magnum revolver. He noted that a martial arts master is not obliged to use only a sword, and now he had a keen eye for any weapon. When Lee entered the building, it reminded him of some kind of dilapidated maze. The author said that this was a parallel world based on the reality of Mutant, and its original space had expanded. He noted that more space was better for battle, but Lee replied that this was not always the case. Lee continued to examine the room and noticed lifeless bodies lying on the floor. The number 7 was painted on the sleeves of their jackets, and Lee realized that this was the Phantom 7 group. Shin's words came to mind, that only 2 teams remained at the academy, the Green Sword and the Phantom 7, and now one of the teams lay before him, sent to the other world. In his imagination, Lee pictured himself bursting into the building and heroically saving them, but it didn't work out. He immediately thought that it was too dangerous, but God said that he should think about developing his character and not about the danger. After all, Li Huan was the strongest character in the world. When our hero heard this, he realized that he had to move on. He took the weapons from the group and realized that regardless of experience, bad things happen when you least expect them. Picking up a grenade from the floor, he thought that he couldn't let his guard down with this author. After these thoughts, something exploded and blew the door to one of the rooms. And that's when our hero realized that the author liked this situation. But that only made him happy, so he ran into the room whose door had been blown off. Since he had picked up the grenade in advance, he immediately threw it into the room as he ran past. After a deafening explosion, dust rose into the air, and our hero entered the room, covering his face, but found nothing suspicious. Behind him, several pale pink, terrifying creatures immediately appeared in the room. They were Sharpmans, very fast demons that were strong at jumping. They tore their enemies apart with their teeth, or attacked with their blade-like hands. They immediately attacked our hero, but being strong, he easily began to fend off their blows. After destroying them, he said that the author had done an excellent job creating such ugly creatures. After these words, a huge demon leader appeared before him, similar to the previous ones, possessing a powerful heart with a concentration of evil. The heart of a demon from other worlds was a trophy that could be processed and used in various ways. The leader of the Sharpmans began to scream desperately, which hurt Lee's ears. But this scream was not directed at our hero, but at the horde of other Sharpmans. Seeing the approaching crowd of demons, our hero grabbed his sword and realized that this was going to be epic. Lee calmly asked the leader if all these monsters had been repaired for him or not. He decided to strike the leader first, as he continued to make a lot of noise and infuriate Lee. Our hero rushed straight into the crowd of demons, splitting them with his sword on the right and left. At one point, he took out a firearm to improve his effectiveness. After destroying the entire crowd, he realized that the leader was still there, and he offered to continue the battle. Smiling, he took grenades out of his pocket and threw them at the leader and the remaining demons behind him. Dust rose around them, and the author wrote that Qi Li Huan was 120 years old, but thanks to the heavenly fire, he had grown 60 years younger. He asked Li why he didn't use the 12-point technique when he met the main demon. The author wanted to call Li's next strike the dragon-slaying strike, and with one strike, he could defeat anyone. In addition, Li thought he would get some other trophy from this place. Continuing to fight with the leader, Li said that it was good that he was fighting a representative of the third world, but he assumed that he must have had a more important reason for meeting this monster. This could make the chapter even more interesting, and God listened to him. The fight with the leader was getting harder, and Li asked the author to think of a meaning faster. Li asked the author to come up with it faster than he would send the leader to the other world. When Li plunged his sword into the demon's heart, he saw that the end of the main storyline was marked. Realizing this, Li turned to the author and asked if he was done with the main storyline. The author was only too happy to answer this question and shouted that he had everything prepared, and now Li was the heir to the heavenly demon. He came to this world after regression with only one goal: to obtain the inheritance of the heavenly demon. Before the regression, there was only one entity left in the parallel world. There was a legend that if he used it, he would not be able to earn the inheritance of the heavenly demon. As a result, a battle broke out among the powerful of this world, regardless of race. Li was the only third-level master, and he participated in the war following the order of the King of Frozen Blades. And then, even the great wizard Megrez led his army onto the battlefield. They planned to end this battle once and for all. It was a long and difficult battle, and Li Huan was the winner as the only survivor. And just like that, he became a contender for the legacy of the heavenly demon. Li realized that the savage had what he needed, and since there had been no battle yet, there would be many secret documents and treasures. Our hero understood that the sooner he got to this demon, the better. The author was delighted that they would continue their fantastic work together. Li walked down the corridor, calling out to this demon, and saying that he was already hungry. Finally, he found the room he was looking for, and, entering it, asked how the local demon was doing. He replied that he was curious why the sharpshooters had suddenly gone quiet, and now it was clear that it was Li's doing. Savage was the final boss of the Piano Academy, and he said that he had grown bored and hoped that playing with Li would be interesting. After all the previous ones had been too boring for him, which made him sad. Li was tired of the demon's long monologue and asked if he was finished. Savage was enraged that an ordinary person dared to address him so familiarly. He summoned a magic circle behind him and said that he would fight with advanced techniques, especially for Li. In the next moment, a huge hand emerged from this magic circle. Li was a little scared and asked if it was as difficult as it looked. The demon gloated that his power had frightened our hero and asked how he liked it. Savage shouted that Li had fallen into despair when he saw his overwhelming power. But after a moment, our hero replied that he was bored and responded to his attack with fire, saying that it was nothing. Li used a secret technique of the heavenly demon. He did this to temporarily increase his ki, and it was a secret weapon for a single strike. The demon savage shouted that Li couldn't possess such power and that it was impossible, but his demon technique was immediately shattered by Li's blow and scattered into millions of pieces. After that, our hero decided to punch Savage in the face with his fist. This blow had incredible power stored inside our hero. After his opponent was neutralized by this blow, Li shoved a gun into his mouth and said it was a gift. He fired and reminded the demon that his game was now over. At that moment, our hero grabbed a small sphere that flew out of the demon and landed gently on the floor. Looking at the sphere, he realized that he now knew what the legacy of the heavenly demon looked like, and that was the end of the chapter. Breathing out after the battle, our hero noted that it was easier than he had initially expected. After that, he reminded himself again that he was hungry, but saw that the author was sitting in the corner, looking nervous. Looking at him, Li couldn't understand what could have happened to affect him so much. Suddenly, screenshots of comments under the novel began to swirl around our hero. Yu Hyun wrote that the story had a great vibe, and she was eagerly awaiting the continuation. Park Yeon-jin wrote that he liked Reincarnation and couldn't wait for the next episode. Ah Hwang wrote that she wished the author of the novel victory in the competition and noted the coolness of the plot. In general, people wrote that the story was original and interesting, and that they wanted a sequel. Li noted that, in general, he thought all the comments were quite positive. But suddenly he noticed a red negative comment that said the author should stop writing until he simply removed the hero. The author replied that he was very sorry, but he would not remove the main character because he had invested too much in the character. Li asked the author to tell him about such comments in the future, and the author was worried that this comment was at the top. Our hero knew that there were 2 top comments for each chapter, and that their atmosphere could ruin the whole work. Lee understood the author's excitement perfectly at that moment, because he had been in his shoes many times. But that didn't justify running away in the middle of the plot. And Lee said that the comment was at the top because of the author's response, and that the comment suggested a terrible cliché. At that moment, the story's rating dropped and moved to 38th place. The author said it was a failure, and Lee was surprised that he even participated in competitions with such stress resistance. At that moment, negative comments about the main character and clichés began to surface. The author had already begun to think about rewriting the main character from the beginning, but our hero shouted at the author to pull himself together and finally calm down. In addition, he really hoped that the world would not be destroyed because of the god's worries. Lee couldn't believe that the novel would fail, and then he saw a bright golden light above his head. It turned out that a new best comment had been posted, in which Ari wrote that it was the best of the most anticipated works in the competition. Ari described how, while reading the novel, you could even feel the author's efforts and completely immerse yourself in it. And now Lee was surprised that one sincere comment could have such a positive effect on the author. Lee felt a sense of relief and hoped that he and the author had turned the page on this unfortunate episode. After that, our hero finally went to lunch. His settings had changed, and it turned out that his favorite food was soup, and he had to eat it often. And even though Lee had already eaten, when they brought him soup again, he felt hungry again. Shin approached him at the table and said that Lee should eat more, and our hero did not resist. He asked her why she had followed him, and Shin replied that she wanted to thank him for helping to destroy the parallel world. Shin was surprised at how easily Lee had dealt with it, and so the security bureau had an offer for him. Lee was curious to know what the offer was, and wondered what the author was up to this time. At that moment, a boy ran up to him, and seeing the sword in his backpack, asked if Lee practiced martial arts. The boy's mother immediately came over and apologized for her son interrupting Lee's meal. Lee asked if the boy had heard of the Harem Piano Academy, and if so, he added that he had finished his business there. At that moment, Shin shouted his name, and Lee asked her why she did that. She replied that she was sorry, but this information was not yet public and should not have been shared with everyone, and that she shouted accidentally. In the end, she said why she had come, and it was an invitation to work for the security bureau. For this mission, they wanted to give him the title of Shin Song, and Lee thought he would have to make his debut again. In the end, they added to the novel that Lee would teach Shin the dragon-slaying strike, which surprised him greatly. Shin said that Lee didn't have a clan, so the bureau would help with the official announcement of the end of the parallel world at a press conference. Lee was upset that he couldn't change the settings that had already been set, and Shin asked him about the conditions for joining the bureau. Lee decided that since it had gone this far, he would take advantage of it, and said he wasn't sure he wanted to join, but he said he would be grateful for their help with the official announcement. Our hero believed that this would give him the opportunity to make his name known throughout the world, and at that moment, it would be more natural if he were discovered. After all, he was a famous martial artist who had been found by accident. Shin started by asking Lee to exchange contact information. Lee replied that he would send Shin all the necessary information via the number he showed on his phone screen. When he got home and took a shower, he immediately received a new message. In it, Shin asked if Lee would mind if she disclosed his personal information, and he did not mind. He was just happy that everything was going according to his plan, and decided to meet with the long-awaited legacy of the Cheonma Zone. Lee couldn't wait to see what amazing treasure the author had prepared. The Call of the World Eye Sphere connected the space with the place where the legacy of Cheonma was hidden. With its help, it was possible to put an end to the parallel world. The legacy of Cheonma included treasures such as secret techniques, including the technique of the divine Cheonma. Lee decided that it was time to level up, and time was on his side. He wondered what treasures awaited him there. But suddenly, a strange woman and man appeared before him. One was named Il Shin. The other was named Wol Shin, and they were both guardians of the legacy of the Cheonma Zone. They both looked at Lee and said that from that moment on, they would test him. They were two generals of the Heavenly Kingdom, Il Shin and Wol Shin. They guarded the legacy of the Heavenly Zone under their command. They also tested the participants to see if they were worthy of inheriting the legacy of Cheonma. Lee realized that if he was to be tested, then what lay before him was not just a treasure. The author noted that it was a relic and would not be easy to obtain. Lee told the generals that he already possessed the skill of the Heavenly Horse. God said that there were two parts to the test. In the first part, the participants' abilities were lower than those of an expert, and they were pushed to their limits. Their willpower and desire were tested. If they reached a certain level, they passed the test. No one in the world could break through this illusion with their physical abilities. The second part of the test takes place when the participant has reached their full strength. As a result, they must fight two generals at once. If there are many participants, the generals turned to the soldiers of the heavenly kingdom. Lee asked how this applied to him, and did not understand if he needed to do anything right away. Ilshin pointed her weapon at him, and asked what he was babbling about, and suggested that he stop humiliating himself and focus on the test. Lee replied that he was pleased to see the generals again, and asked if they recognized him, since he had already passed the test once. Lee didn't want to waste time on the test, and said so. The generals began to discuss whether this was the guy the leadership had mentioned. He said that he had returned to his younger self through time travel. The generals assumed that this must be the case. Lee said he was sure that the test they were giving him was not for him. 2 parts of the test were for those with abilities below that of experts. Lee added that he knew about the battles with the male participant, and noted that the energy of Emchan flowed through him. This was because he had already taken the source of this energy from the Mekajin Ren clan. Lee told the author that he wanted to skip the test and take advantage of the fact that he had been reincarnated. The generals looked at each other because they couldn't understand how Lee knew about their test. Wolshin began to get nervous and thought that our hero was mocking them. He drew his sword and shouted for him to stop talking nonsense and tried to stop them. But Ilshin interrupted him, saying that Lee could calmly tell them the truth. After all, he used defensive energy to control Emcheon's energy, and he knew exactly how they were being tested. Ilshin said that Wolshin was stuck on his path, and therefore could not advance in rank. She looked at our hero again, and asked him if he was really Li Huan. Ilshin noted that if his words were true, he should treat them to a meal, and that way he would pass the test. To do this, he first had to guess the general's favorite foods. Lee began to think and decided that Ilshin loved alcohol the most. Wolshin preferred meat the most, after which the character's characteristics were changed. Ilshin told Lee to bring the food to the table, and if the food did not suit their tastes, he would have to undergo the usual test. Our hero replied that he was sure they would like what he had to offer. Lee assumed that everyone loved chicken and beer, so he decided to offer them just that. He asked them not to interfere with his preparation, and to just relax. Lee went to the refrigerator because he decided that there should be food in it, but he immediately discovered that there was no alcohol in his refrigerator. However, there was a drink of living death and a drink that controlled spirits on the shelf. The author began to explain that if Lee used the first drink, he would be able to revive those who had died within a few days after their death. The spirit-controlling drink allowed him to control spirits. Drinking part of it would allow him to control spirits temporarily, and drinking the whole bottle would allow him to control them permanently. Lee asked why it had suddenly appeared in his refrigerator, and the author noted that they had their own uses and would come in handy. The author said that Lee should take the drink of living death with him, and then leave this place. At that moment, the generals asked why it was taking so long, and Lee shouted that he needed to order delivery. Then he decided that he should have money in his account and decided to check his balance. He had received part-time wages when he worked various side jobs before becoming a master, but there was little money in his account. The money was deducted for rent and communication, and on top of that, his money was stolen by the Quan Sang Hu gang. In addition, Lee noticed that he kept receiving messages. Then he realized that it was because of breaking news, because now he was known as a strategist. Lee thought it was because the author had come up with another strange setting. It turned out that it was because of the announcement that he was receiving so much attention from everywhere. The announcement revealed that Lee had grown up in an orphanage, and Lee also saw the price of chicken for the first time in the news, which surprised him. At that time, the Security Bureau announced that something had happened recently in the midst of the destruction of the parallel world of the Piano Academy. A master from the parallel world, identified as Lord Savage, had been destroyed, and Li Huan had defeated him. Only his photo and name were provided, and his belongings were not. The Bureau meeting was upset by this, and wanted Li Huan to attend a Security Bureau briefing. Shin said that they had managed to establish contact with him, but had not been able to capture him. She was asked to bring him to the Bureau because it was beneficial for the Bureau itself. Since there was little information about him in the public domain, it was difficult for other special services to find him. Now Shin had to wait for specific instructions for future actions. She understood that he could be a dangerous opponent, but not an enemy to her. At this time, our hero approached the hospital, which was one of the black markets, and was run by the Minister of the Golden Ring. Looking at it, Lee wondered if he could get money in this place, and decided to try anyway. This place housed a hotel, an arena, a casino, the black market headquarters, and a checkpoint, and Lee was surprised that there was so much going on. In addition to the hidden world, there were entertainment facilities for people with special abilities, and it also had its own currency. Outwardly, the building was an abandoned hospital, but inside, the place was enchanting. A local security guard approached him and asked if it was our hero's first time there. The guard asked for Lee's ID, and our hero calmly handed it over. The guard then began to check the information by scanning it. After a few seconds, he returned the documents and told our hero that access was granted. The doors to the staircase leading somewhere upstairs opened before Lee. After selling items from the academy, Lee planned to study the black market better. All along the staircase were demonic organisms that initially appeared to be mushrooms, spreading powerful neurotoxins. Lee was surprised that demons were even in such places, and that the system was truly vigilant. Upon entering the next room, Lee was surprised that he had not seen anything like this on the streets, and now understood that they were all here. In the corridor on this floor, there were creatures of many races: elves, wizards, and martial arts masters. They talked about supplies for beginners, crystal balls made of diamonds, the exchange rate of demonic currency, and much more. Some talked about selling equipment, while others talked about exciting games in the arena. A few minutes later, a huge orc warrior passed by Lee, whom our character admired. There was too much going on around him now, and Lee thanked the writer for such diversity. In addition, our hero noticed that people were whispering around him, and assuming that he was the #1 person in the ranking, and that he had conquered the academy. These people also wanted to take pictures with our hero, and he enjoyed experiencing popularity. In any case, he noticed that every hero here had at least one firearm, and when everyone has a weapon, the balance of power becomes somewhat unique. But our hero came to the conclusion that he was the best and unmatched in defeating enemies and combining firearms and magic. Soon he found a shop where he could sell all the items he had found, and that was Sugol's shop. The first thing he said to the shop owner was a greeting to the goblin. The goblin Sugol himself noted that Lee was new because he had never seen him before. The goblin assumed that since Lee was smiling so much, the items in his bag must be quite good. Lee asked him not to rush with the inspection of the items, and Sugol said that he would just evaluate them for now. Our hero noted that there were quite a few weapons in the store, and Sugol replied that he didn't charge for viewing them and that he shouldn't feel shy. Sugol found some good grenades and evil bullets for the Magnum, and these items had a fixed price, and even 35 coins was not profitable. But since it was their first deal, Sugol decided to pay 47 coins for everything, and that was the best price. Lee was surprised by such prices and asked why they were so low, but Sugol asked him not to confuse the prices of the outside world with the local ones. After all, the cost of cleaning the items was already included in the price, and it was impossible to track them. Lee understood that it was risky if a record remained and information about bad organizations came out. Our hero realized that he had no choice and would have to sell at this price. But the author appeared and asked if Lee planned to sell the items and leave. Lee replied that he was in a hurry to get to the monthly divine market and needed to hurry up, and the god reminded him about the items from the hiding place. Our hero remembered that he had a drink of living death with him. The author noted that since the goblin had come out, Lee should use it because it was difficult to store. Then the goblin said that Lee should have told him about it if he really had something so cool. The author told Lee that they needed to deal with cool people, like the owner of this building. Lee agreed that it would be good to meet someone influential for future negotiations. He turned to the author and asked how he could meet the owner, but the author had disappeared. When Lee realized that the goblin hadn't heard them, he decided that he had finished all his business here. Lee told Sugol that he had a counteroffer and suggested taking only 10 coins as payment. Sugol said that if it was a request, Lee should go to the 5th floor, but Lee asked him not to rush to conclusions. He said he had heard a story about Turg, the Minister of War of the Golden Ring, and this interested the goblin. Lee said that after a large-scale clash, Minister Turg was looking for his lost younger brother, and Lee knew where to find him. If what Lee said turned out to be a lie, Sugol would also be in danger, but if it was true, the minister would greatly appreciate it. Lee managed to create a treasure called 1,000 Manhua Ren, and introduced Minister Turg to his lost relative. He imagined a wristwatch and said that with its help, he could establish contact with Minister Turg. Sugol understood that the stakes were too high, higher than his own life, but he said he would not be a goblin if he did not accept this offer. Sugol agreed, even though he said it could cost him his life, and his rank was raised to supporting character, and a great legend began. Sugol waved his hand and said he was leaving, and hoped that Lee would want him to return. Lee sat in the hallway and thought about how long this legend would take. Then, an unknown man approached him and asked if our hero's name was Lee. Our hero looked at him and thought that the author had something else in mind when he added this man. The author said that this place was a good arena for betting, and it would be a waste of time not to use it. Lee thought it was not a good idea to use the written space to show the betting arena. Nevertheless, looking at the man in front of him, our hero could not shake the feeling that this guy was a loser. But he asked our hero what was going on, and if he had noticed anything unusual. Looking at this man, Lee quickly began to come up with a backstory for him. He said he knew that he was facing Chang Yan from the Blood Sect, and that in the future, he would become the sect's elder. He would be called the Evil Master Chu, and that would be his alternative name. He was young, but Lee saw the face of the Evil Master Chu, and he turned into an evil master using pack pills. Before his regression, Lee lost a valuable follower, and to take revenge, he sought out the bloody sect and managed to destroy the elder Chu. That is why our hero now called the young Chu lucky, because of the circumstance. He asked Lee if he was really the boss of the Laren Academy at the Baron level, because it was just hype, and he did not believe the rumors, only his own eyes. However, Lee saw no point in fighting him, so he had to come up with something more substantial. Then, our hero noticed a red and gold sheath and a sword in it on Chu's belt. An ideal plan came to his mind, and he began to tell Chu a story. This story was about a man, a disciple of a bloody sect, who simply took and stole a secret weapon and ran away. After that, our hero tapped the scabbard on Chu's belt and asked if it was true. Lee called Chu's sword the Sword of Despair of a Bloody Battle, and Chu just grabbed the sword, which was considered a relic, tightly. The precious sword allowed even those who had not reached the first-class level to wield its energy, which changed flexibly like a whip. Before the regression, it was also the main weapon of one of the characters who killed Lee. In addition, Lee was almost sent to the other world many times by this sword. At that moment, Lee learned that he was not killed by one person. Chu replied that Lee seemed to have a keen eye and did not seem to be a real beginner. Lee clarified that his skills were not convincing enough for Chu. Therefore, our hero proposed to fight a fair battle and risk everything. Chu asked if our hero was afraid of losing. Chu said that if he won, he would only be able to get a few demonic balls from Lee. Lee also mentioned the demonic crystal. Chu thought he had misheard and asked Lee to repeat what he had said. At that moment, our hero took the demonic crystal out of his pocket. Then Lee immediately put it back in his pocket, saying that Chu would definitely want it and that they could bet these things. It was hard for Chu to believe that Lee had obtained the demonic crystal after his first conquest in the parallel world. Chu thought that Lee was just lucky, but our hero still insisted on a battle. He thought that he could eliminate the evil master Chu and take the treasure that the King of Bloody Swords cherished most. This turned his actions into a double blow, and Lee would be happy if everything worked out. Chu thanked Lee for being the first to propose the battle and asked if he wanted to start right away. In general, the growth of the black market in this place could be explained to a large extent by the activities of the betting arena. It was protected by magic, and inside, personalities fought battles, while outside, bets were placed. Before the battle, Lee could choose any weapon on display, but its quality was not guaranteed. In the same place, he found Sugol, who was surprised that Lee was there. He did not understand why he had agreed to the battle. In addition, he was against the strongest member of the sect, and Sugol did not understand how confident Lee was in his victory. Lee replied that he had everything figured out, and that as soon as he defeated him, everyone's doubts would be dispelled. Lee told the doubting Sugol that people said he was the Baron of the Harem Academy, but people didn't believe him. Sugol added that his superiors had told him to go downstairs and wait while they investigated Lee. Our hero realized that he should take advantage of this, because his reputation would improve after this battle. After that, Lee asked Sugol to give him 10 shots, which surprised Sugol. But Lee reminded him that Sugol owed him, and Sugol began to count them and asked if Lee was really on a raid in Harem or not. Lee said that Sugol would find out when the battle began, after which he handed his sword to the appraiser and asked him to change his assessment before the battle. In the arena, bets were made based on information provided by the parties, and the player himself had to decide whether it was true or false. In addition, it was forbidden to place bets after the start of the match. Moreover, the loser's property was automatically transferred to the winner. The odds for Lee's victory were 9-1, and Chu's were 1.5-1, and the host noted that Lee's rating had been changed to Master. The people in the stands shouted that this could not be true, and that Lee was too cocky. After all, Master was a level at which a person began to use swords and defensive techniques, and only the leaders of sects possessed it. Lee saw that Sugol had bet very little on his victory, and asked why, and Sugol replied that he was saving his money. He added that he was not used to relying on luck, and these words hurt Lee a little. Lee entered the arena, and the announcer declared that this match would be the main event of the day. The battle would be between Chang Yan, the great heir to the Blood Clan, and Li Huan, the man everyone was talking about. Lee looked at his opponent and could see from his face that he had no intention of losing. In addition, our hero was surprised that his opponent would use his own sword. At that moment, Lee felt a strange atmosphere around him and heard every shout from the stands, supporting both him and his opponent. He couldn't figure out what this feeling was and why his heart was beating so wildly. Our hero assumed that it could be due to the surrounding atmosphere, but the author wrote that it was excitement from the King of Swords' weapon. So Chang Yang couldn't handle him and went crazy, and besides, Lee knew that the sword would soon be his. In any case, our hero was reassured by the thought that he would benefit from this fight. Chang Yang held out a sword that was not his own toward Lee, and asked him if he thought he had reached his peak and to try to defeat him. Lee replied that it made no difference whether he was at his peak or not. His sword lit up with purple lightning, and he said he would show Lee something interesting. This light was the aura of the sword, and the people in the stands were very surprised because it meant that Lee was a true master. Chang En also saw this and was horrified by the news, because Lee was truly at his peak. But our hero calmly replied that it was too early to be surprised. Before entering the battle, he had redirected the horse's blood into his body, one of the 12 great combat techniques. This power transformed strength into another attribute. The energy gathered with its help was transformed into the Il-Yang Shimpab technique. Lee understood that he could not show the Qianma technique here, but he could use the recently acquired 7th strike of Il-Yang. The 7-strike ball technique consisted of a sequential increase in the power of the strikes. The main rule of the technique was to finish the series of strikes. Our hero attacked Chang Yan and told him that the real show was about to begin. The first strike was so powerful that it destroyed Chang's protective suit. The first strike threw Lee's opponent to the edge of the area, which he did not expect. Then Chang Yan realized that this strike would have caused him more problems if it weren't for his artifact. Lee's second blow came, and Chang En decided that he urgently needed to get his sword because he was facing a master. He realized that Lee had no intention of stopping there, and that he would have to do something. This was true, and Lee did indeed begin to deliver the third blow of his technique. Chang En decided to try to block Lee's blow, and held his sword in front of him. But Lee's third long slashing blow was merciless, and looking at his opponent, Chang En thought he was going to die. Although he withstood the blow, he fell to the floor and thought that he couldn't lose his life so foolishly. He remembered that he still had the ancient dragon sword at his disposal, and although he understood that if he used it here, everyone would realize that he had stolen it. Nevertheless, for Chang En, his survival was more important than anything else, and our hero himself said at that moment that he would send him to the other world. At that moment, Chang En tried to summon the air mastery of the Blood Clan. A merciless whirlwind immediately appeared around Lee, and even though Chang En understood that it would not hold him for long, it should have been enough time to draw the sword from its sheath. Chang En thought that even if Lee was a master, he would not be able to cope with the treasure of the Blood Clan with the fierce dragon sword. Nevertheless, in a matter of seconds, our hero managed to destroy the whirlwind around him. And Chang En didn't even have time to think that it was impossible when Lee struck him with a 4th crescent-shaped blow. This blow knocked Chang En unconscious, and now Lee was the winner of this fight. The host shouted that Li Huan had succeeded and was now the winner. Sugol was shocked that Lee had managed to do it so quickly. The host noted that he had been hosting matches for a long time, but had never seen such battles before. After this announcement, everyone was surprised that Lee did not stop his attacks. Lee understood that this was a technique that he had to finish once he had started, because it was an unchanging technique. At that moment, everyone realized that this was the unchanging technique of the 7 sword strikes created by the first Reaper, Yang. Sugol was shocked that Lee had inherited this legendary martial arts technique. Before undergoing regression, Lee was unable to master the technique of the Heavenly Demon's Fist Strike, and then he stumbled upon this technique of 7 strikes, wandering the streets of the black market. The reason Li Huan paid attention to it was because of the 7 techniques. The first, Qi Yang, is a unique life force that has been compared to the burning heavens. This is because its well-known forms resemble the divine arts of the heavenly demon. At that moment, Lee's strikes began to destroy the arena, and the host asked the audience not to be afraid, and they realized that he was truly a master. After the last blow, Lee seemed to come to his senses and heard the announcer say that a new star had been born before their eyes. Li Huan was declared the winner, and now he was the new star master. But Lee himself did not remember what had happened or how he had won. The stands chanted his name, and he looked at the destroyed arena and realized that he had done it. The host approached him with a microphone and asked if he wanted to say something to the audience. Lee took the microphone and asked if everyone was convinced that he was the absolute winner of the Darum piano competition. And if anyone still didn't believe it, he invited them to fight him in a fair one-on-one battle. The host replied that this was a bold statement, as Chang Yun was carried off the stage. It turned out that no one wanted to fight him, and the host said it was time to wrap up the match. He thanked the winner for demonstrating his mastery of martial arts, and awarded him 200 bullets. Lee received a lot of money, and all the stands chanted his name, which made him very happy. But besides that, people did not see that he had received a sword, which was much cooler than the cash prize. When Lee left the arena, he received his bullets and realized that he could buy a lot of beer and chicken with them. In addition, he received a powerful ancient dragon sword. Lee saw that Sugol looked disappointed, but he mentioned that he had said he would bet on him, and that it was simply a missed opportunity. Sugol responded by asking our hero what he was looking for, again, from the very beginning. Lee replied that he was looking for artifacts, and asked if he had anything worthwhile, because it was an artifact that had helped his opponent hold out for so long. Sugol was surprised that Lee didn't have a single artifact with him, and found it incredible that Lee had decided to look for them only after the fight. He added that Lee would soon be so famous that he would definitely need artifacts, but all artifacts were expensive. Lee knew this, and asked to look for something useful, and Sugol asked what kind of thing. The choices were magic, artillery, and demonic techniques. Lee decided that it would be good for him to get an artifact that protects against firearms. Just as he was looking for it, a goblin entered the store, and said that he was looking forward to working with Lee, and introduced himself as Ra. Ra said that he apologized for not being able to meet with Lee for so long, and our hero said that it was no big deal. After all, during that time, Lee had greatly helped Sugol, even though it was dangerous, and he deserved credit for his help. Sugol joined the conversation and said that he had done nothing to deserve credit, and that he was eternally indebted to his superiors. He added that he would pretend he hadn't heard anything, so that they could talk to each other in peace. Ra knew that the whole world was pointing fingers at him, but he was sure that there was no race that would respond with such sincerity. After that, he adjusted his tie and noted that they needed to get down to business. His face became more serious, and he asked where the boss's younger brother was. Lee was frightened by his gaze and thought that the meeting was going according to plan, despite entering the arena. Ra said that if he had already met with the boss's younger brother, they would try to settle everything without complicating the situation. Lee said that this was not the case, and asked Ra if he wanted to ask him how he knew this location. Ra replied that His Excellency had only one desire, and that was to find his brother. Everything else was secondary to him. Lee thought that their determination was simply incredible. Lee decided to pull himself together in front of the Minister of War and began his story. Our hero apologized for what he was about to say and said that the minister's brother was already close to him. Ra did not understand what our hero meant and asked him to repeat it. He shouted that they had already searched everywhere and found it hard to believe that he was close to his boss. Ra said that if it turned out to be nonsense, he would not forgive Lee. And Lee asked Ra if he knew why dark magicians were evil. He went on to say that the source of their power was sorrow, pain, and death. And Lee did not know the business of this demon, or dark wizard, and he could not even guess why he was doing it. But Lee could say for sure that it was part of an insidious plot to overthrow the kingdom of Golden Spring, aimed at the Minister of War. After that, Lee asked Ra if he thought the minister had changed during his search for his brother. Lee explained the origin of their curse. The first curse was the minister's grief over the loss of his brother, and the growth of the minister's spirit in sorrow. The second curse was pain. Lee asked how his brother would feel being in a cage and seeing his older brother go mad. Ra began to shout, asking what Lee meant by a cage and going mad. Lee said that his brother was in something that the minister always carried with him, but he did not understand what it was. He assumed that they had maximized the power of the curse, and that the pain had been accumulating for decades. The third curse was quite simple. It was death. In the near future, his younger brother's soul would be torn apart, and then a curse would be placed on the minister. This would result in the complete shackling of not only the minister's body, but also his soul. And then some evil, dark mage would eventually take possession of the minister. Ra did not understand what these dark magicians would gain from this event, even if they captured the minister. Lee said that they would gain the minister's power, and with the power that had been accumulated in the kingdom over a long period of time, a coup d'etat could occur. And so they would try to seize the kingdom of Golden Spring itself. The author overheard this conversation and said that Lee had come up with a crazy story, and that it was right to bring Lee in. All this time, Il-shin and Wol-shin were waiting in Lee's apartment. Wol-shin shouted that he couldn't wait any longer for Lee to return. He shouted that Lee had definitely run away because he didn't want to take the test, and called Il to come with him. But she said that Lee would be back soon. Wol said that if his older sister didn't go, he would go alone, which his older sister was against. At that moment, Lee came in and asked if the generals were waiting for him because he was back. Then Lee walked through the door and realized that they were about to leave, so he asked where they were going. But the generals were distracted by the fact that Lee had brought fried chicken and beer. Il-shin, holding the chicken in her hands, said that it had a very pleasant spicy taste. The elder said that it was very tasty and asked Lee to tell her what this food was called, and Lee replied that it was chimek. She asked Lee to have a snack because he had gone through a lot to buy it. Regarding the meeting, Lee remembered that Ra had promised to convey his words to the general and then contact Lee. He thought that he still had a feeling of unfinished business and realized that he needed to clarify when Ra would contact him. Lee told the generals that since they would soon return to heaven, they should eat well, and that it was enough for him just to watch. Lee told them that he was worried that the sacred texts of the heavenly demons' martial arts would be accessible to the world if they stayed there. At that moment, the generals became completely serious and said that they had assumed they would be able to stay at Lee's house. Lee suggested that this was another test and that they still had some texts left, but they replied that nothing would happen because the successor had appeared right in front of them. Lee replied that if that was the case, he would feel more at ease if the place were closed. Lee was sure that they had finished their work here, and they replied that they had. Lee understood them and said that he did not want to turn a blind eye to the difficult situation of the two generals. The generals were delighted that Lee was so understanding and much kinder than he appeared. He decided to provide them not only with chicken and beer, but also with other food, interesting things, and entertainment. But he had one condition, and the generals were interested in what that condition was. Lee confessed to them that he had been sent to the other world before regressing. Hearing this, the generals cried out in surprise that the heir to the Chongma zone had died. Hearing such excitement from them, Lee asked them to calm down and promised to tell them everything, because in fact, he did not know this himself yet. He added that first they needed to look at the sword in his hand, and the generals did not understand what he was doing with it. Our hero replied that it was a treasure of Helseman, and that he had obtained this trophy while fighting the best participant in the confiscation match. Vol was surprised that Helseman had agreed to this, but Lee replied that this was not the case. Nevertheless, Il noted that Lee was the only one who had the ancient dragon sword, and if they had known about it, they would not have stopped in Helseman. Lee asked if they were both trying to deal with Helseman, and they shouted that this was not true. Lee said that he felt better, and now he didn't have to fear them because his death was connected to Helseman, and taking his weapon was pleasant. Our hero gathered his strength and told them that he intended to take revenge on everyone who contributed to his regression. Vol asked if Lee was thinking about revenge. Then he was just clinging to his wounds. He added that Lee should consider starting his life with a clean slate, because he was not obligated to seek revenge. Bol added that a new life should be started anew, but Il interrupted him and shouted that it was called repaying a debt, and if Lee needed help with revenge, she would help. But Vol didn't understand the point of it. However, that wasn't Lee's condition, and he said he had to complete the revenge himself. He was going to use this apartment as a training ground and a refuge and rule out the possibility of theft. And if intruders got in here, he wanted the generals to deal with them immediately. Protecting the house was his only condition. The generals asked what Lee thought of them, and he hesitated a little when they asked if that was all the condition was. Our hero didn't have time to answer when he saw the sincere joy in their eyes, and they said that if it came to battle, they would definitely win. Lee understood that he had to worry about the Blood Clan because of the ancient dragon sword, and this place would be guarded by the generals. In general, the refuge was both in the apartment and in a parallel world, and the generals could summon an army there. At this time, Ra told the boss about Lee, and the boss asked if he could be trusted, and Ra confirmed this. After all, Lee had proven himself to be the best martial artist in the betting arena. The boss asked why he didn't come to him right away with such abilities. Lee, being a guest, decided to follow the system and seemed like a reliable person. Ra said that this matter concerned not only the boss, but the whole family. Looking at His Highness, Ra asked him to trust him completely. His Majesty was worried about the curse of the evil black magician and did not understand whether it was true or not. After all, in that case, his brother could be locked inside the ring he always carried with him. The king could not imagine how much pain he had endured over half a century. After this thought, he asked for Professor Biga to be brought to him quickly. After all, if his brother was really inside the ring, the only one who could solve this problem was a specialist in mechanical engineering. And if it turned out to be just a false hope, the king said he would no longer be able to restrain himself when looking at knives. However, if it turned out to be true, the king would be indebted to Lee for the rest of his life. The king thought again that if it turned out to be a lie, everything around him would be covered in screams and blood. So he turned to the moon god and asked him to show him the way to where his brother was. Now the character Turg was strengthened, and warriors and knights of the moonlight were added. Turg was now a goblin hero, the founding war minister of the country, and a 5-star warrior of the moonlight. At that moment, in the shelter, Li Wan laughed at the stories Li told, and Il said that it was a great pleasure for her to be with her baby, and she called Li her baby. Li even said that talking to General Il made all his stress disappear, and that he would do anything for them. Il asked what stress meant, and Li explained that people call the energy accumulated in the body stress. She thanked our hero for the explanation, and for teaching her something new, and asked him to continue guiding her, and to call her big sister. Li simply called her older sister Il Shin, and they both laughed at the name. She asked if Li would earn money since they couldn't do it themselves, and Li realized that generals also care about money. Li said that he was the successor to the heavenly horse, and that although he wasn't concerned about money yet, if something happened, he asked if he would get anything. Il said that their relationship was planned in heaven, and that he could just call her sister. Li was delighted that he could do so, and said he didn't mind calling her that. Unfortunately, Il did not know what that meant, and Li explained that it meant he was happy to accept. At that moment, Vol came to his senses, and asked to be called brother, and then fell asleep again. Il and Li realized that alcohol had greatly affected him, and began to laugh at the situation, because they had had a wonderful day. Li had previously been destroyed by his enemies, but he had returned safe and sound. However, he did not need to be obsessed with revenge alone, and could slowly move towards revenge while looking after his own interests. So Li came to the conclusion that he and the author had created a novel in which he was the main character. Already half asleep, Li wondered if his novel would be interesting. He eagerly awaited the opportunity to work with the author again. At that moment, the author arrived and watched the main character's behavior. In the morning, the generals woke up, and, yawning, Il asked if they had any food, while Vol said he wanted to sleep. Li said that he had woken them up for a reason, because he wanted to show them both something. At that moment, Li took out his firearm and said he was going to show it to them. Vol said that he had already seen this thing from Li, and was still curious about it, and Li replied that it was a pistol. Li decided not to explain what it was for long, and just show them right away. Our hero fired the pistol several times, and assumed that the generals were seeing such a weapon for the first time in their lives. This weapon fired bullets at high speed, and according to Li, it was the meaning of civilization. Vol was surprised that Li did not use his inner strength when firing, and therefore anyone could use the pistol. Il was surprised that one could attack simply by pulling the trigger, and did not understand the point of studying martial arts. Li replied that if the weapon fell into the hands of someone who had studied martial arts, it would become even more powerful. After that, our hero asked the generals if they wanted to try it. Vol took the pistol in his hands and was very nervous, so it trembled in his hands, but Li simply told him to find a target. The author watched them and was surprised, but Li said that, as expected of a martial arts master, Vol immediately hit the target. The author asked how Li came up with the idea of letting the generals try out the weapon. God was curious to see what would happen if the generals got their hands on the weapon, and Li showed him this picture. At that moment, Vol accidentally shot Yin, and she did a somersault and caught the bullet in her palm. Both Li and the author were very surprised that she managed to do it, even though she was a master. Yin said that she managed to catch this tricky bullet, and that it wasn't difficult. Now that the generals knew that such a weapon existed in the underworld, Li asked them to remember that their enemies might have it too. Yin said that it was a venom, and that such a thing could not exist in a single copy. So Li suggested that they study it more closely, and they began to train, much to the delight of the author. And just at that moment, our hero received the message he had been waiting for from Ra. Li came to Tsugol's shop, and Tsugol asked him to wait a little longer for the artifact he had ordered. Our hero replied that he had not come to the shop for that. At that moment, Ra and another goblin with a large hood covering his face entered the store. This goblin took off his hood, and Ra told the others to greet Lord Turg, the country's minister of war, with a golden ring. Li immediately bowed to the Lord and introduced himself, saying that he was very pleased to meet him, and Tsugol realized that Li was quick-witted and bowed himself. After that, Tsugol introduced himself and said that this meeting was a great honor for him. Turg himself was surprised that Li knew goblin etiquette and knew that he was being followed. Li knew that embracing the shoulders symbolized the earth, bending the legs symbolized water, and stretching the hips symbolized fire. Altogether, it was a symbol of unity with nature and a daily ritual dedicated to the moon goddess, known as prayer. Since Li was a reborn hero, he already knew all this in advance. At that moment, Ra suggested they talk alone and decided to step aside, as did Tsugol. Tsugol Li thought that he had finally met Minister Turg, because he was curious to see how he would appear in his fictional story. At that moment, Lee saw the comments under the novel, and they were quite positive. The novel's rating was slowly beginning to rise, albeit almost imperceptibly. The author read the comments and saw people's sadness about the situation with Turg and his brother. Lee thought it was ironic that it was his fault for bringing this story into the story, but readers liked it. The author himself noted that they needed emotional scenes, and Lee decided to put the reader's enjoyment first. Lee apologized for telling about the minister's brother so late, but the minister noted that Lee was a benefactor not only to him, but to the whole country. Thanks to him, Turg defeated the black evil magic that was affecting him, and the minister said that Lee could ask for anything he wanted. And now Lee became a kind of tree of generosity for Turg, which gave him the chance to ask for whatever he wanted, and Lee made his decision. He turned to Lord Turg and said that there was one thing he would like to ask for help with. After a while, Lee was walking down the street and thinking that things were taking too long. At that moment, Lee discovered that their novel was in the 23rd place in the competition, and the author was worried that the problem was in the title. Lee thought that their rating was not surprising, since they were only on the 6th chapter, and there was no need to compare themselves with others for now, so as not to get distracted. Even a small oversight in this matter could lead to the collapse of the entire novel, and Lee decided that before he spent a lot of time thinking about trivial things, he needed to think about something important. He decided to start thinking about what new location there would be in the future. In this location, there had to be a new encounter with an enemy or a future partner, and together they would have to fight for some treasure, either together or against each other. All of this was already in the narrative, but every story was built on this, and Lee decided that this time the reward could be the Goblin Kingdom's network and a smartwatch. So, thanks to Turg, Lee received a device to control the cycle of life and death. It was a smartwatch that automatically activated when the pulse dropped to 0. And after receiving this thing, Lee still wondered if it was normal to have a device for reincarnation, followed by rebirth. After all, he assumed that this world must have its own gods, and Lee had to think about how to avoid death several times. Lee had seen many who had crossed the boundaries of the gods, and a world where many gods were mixed in one dimension, with battles involving magic and demons. A deep attachment to any of them would make life tiresome, and the circumstances of Lee's death would not please the gods of death. That is why Lee had to be careful with such a device. At this point, the cult of the god of death, Clotho, was added to the novel. Lee was surprised that such a cult was suddenly added to the novel, and the author replied that if he was nervous, he could offer a prayer of death. Everything written becomes reality, and this was new and impulsive for Lee. The Dawn Pilgrims of the cult of Clotho served the god of death and wore a badge symbolizing the eye of Clotho. Lee decided to offer a prayer and took out a bullet. The girl receiving the prayers asked if there was a name to mention. Our hero hoped that the offering would convey his desire to be alone, and he asked for his name to be mentioned in the prayer. Then Lee noticed that someone was following him, and said that someone was doing their job very well and was faithful to it. When Lee turned around, he saw Shin again and realized that she was there because of the valuable piece of land belonging to the Pilgrims of Clotho. She said she didn't know that Lee wanted to look good before his death, and he said that the younger you are, the better you should take care of yourself. Lee realized that Shin simply liked the author, but he had no affection for her, even though they were on the same wavelength. Shin asked our hero what he would do with the Sword of Despair, because it was too heavy a burden for one clan to bear. Lee was surprised that Shin knew about the sword, which meant that someone was following him. Lee turned away and asked her not to worry about it, because he would figure it out himself. But Shin caught our hero's attention by saying that the Blood Sect had become active. After all, the Sword of Despair was a relic of the Blood Sect, and if things continued this way, Shin said that Lee would surely meet his end. Lee replied that Shin was talking like a rookie agent who thought she knew some clever way to solve the problem. Shin, confident in her words, replied that it was work for his country, and that by working in the bureau, he would be able to avoid danger. Shin herself spoke of the Blood Sect as an excuse, and now he had to understand that it would be difficult for him to deal with it alone. At that moment, Lee saw a notification that the main story, titled "The Secret Weapon of the Security Bureau," had begun. After that, our hero burst out laughing, completely unable to control himself. He was amused by the words about the secret weapon and serving the country, and thought it sounded fun. So Lee thought about the difference between this and the character's life before regression. After all, the characters lived sacrificing themselves for someone else, but in the end, they had to be sent to the other world. And if they regressed, didn't that mean they had to live differently than before? This time, he wanted to live differently. Lee thought that he could now come up with a new storyline, and he needed to come up with new places and events for the new agent, and even new conditions. Then Lee asked if Shin was responsible for the most uncontrollable area in the Bureau. Shin got nervous and said it was true, and Lee asked where it was. She was a little embarrassed and replied that it was the Incheon area, and Lee replied that he understood now. Lee said that it was not a solution if the blood cult was involved, even if it was Incheon. Here was a miracle of miracles from the fragments of lifeless gods. This treasure of treasures was a real gold ring, and according to Lee, there was not one but two of these rings. The author wrote down our hero's words in detail, and was greatly surprised by the information about the gold rings. The author latched on to these two words, and decided that he liked the name. Shin asked if he was telling the truth, and Lee replied that not everyone could get into the most uncontrollable area. Lee asked what Shin thought about her sending him to Incheon, and getting a gold ring in return. After all, this meant the appearance of a new character as part of a premeditated plan. Shin became nervous, and asked where our hero got this information. Lee explained that Ilyang Chilguk and their tradition of succession was considered weaker than that of other sects, but all power passed to one person. In addition, Lee had information that was not disclosed to the public, and Shin could decide for herself whether she wanted to receive the ring or not. She asked because she couldn't risk everything relying on information from an unverified source. Nevertheless, she understood that refusing the ring would be simply insane. At that point, Lee said that it had been decided that he would go to the Icheon area. While they were driving to Icheon, Lee said that high-ranking demons were looking for rings to increase their power. They were unaware of the true power hidden within them. These words were a hint for the author to create a suitable opponent. Shin still hoped that this demon would not be too strong. At this point, the author strengthened all types of demons. Among the demons, there was a class called Destruction that destroyed everything in its path. The Golden Ring of Light, which would become the treasure of this chapter and feature in the story, was also completed. At that moment, Shin thought about accompanying a person who had no right to be in the area and would be fired if they found out. But if everything went well, she would receive the Golden Ring, along with the capture of Li Huan. She did not understand how officials who eliminated criminals could not contribute to social stability, because in the past, that was above all else. Now, more than ever, the world was ruled by the logic of power and nothing else. And now Shin had the opportunity to get rid of it. She looked at Lee and thought that it might not be just about the ring. Shin didn't understand why Lee was doing this and why he was doing it. He appeared out of nowhere and brought something new to her everyday life. At that moment, Lee noticed that Shin was looking at him and asked if he was too handsome. Shin slammed on the brakes because the question shocked her. Lee realized that there was indeed something human in her, and he told her that she was staring at him intently. They got out of the car in the vicinity of Icheon, which was a lawless area still within the country's territory. Nevertheless, the country had practically abandoned the area, showing complete disregard for it. Looking around, Lee thought that it was spacious enough to stage battles without hitting the city center. Shin said it would be better to leave the car there, and asked Lee if he knew what kind of place it was. She clarified that if he acted alone here, he would surely end up dead. Looking at Shin, Lee said that she looked like a security agent, and that everyone understood that. Now the Bureau had the opportunity to declare retaliation if their employee was injured, and Lee realized that the author was sincere with him in his settings. Shin asked where they were going, and Lee replied that they were going to the old industrial complex because he needed to check something. He understood that he would find a specific task there, and that 2 gold rings would be there. The author had a revelation, and said that this was the most dangerous area in the country for one reason. Namely, because the Knight of Doom with 2 gold rings, the daughter of the Demon Queen Minstrel, was hiding there. Lee noted that he had asked the author to create a suitable demon, not a boss-level monster, but the author said that it would only be more fun that way. Our hero realized that it was always the same thing, and the difficulty was too high. He understood that he had no choice, and would have to reduce the difficulty. Then he turned to Agent Shin, and told her that he had to be honest. He mentioned that the 2 gold rings he had talked about were in the demon's possession. Shin was shocked by these words, and shouted about how strong this demon was, and why she had found out about it so late. Lee began to convince her that the demon was quite weak at that moment. At that moment, Shin said that she also had something to confess. Lee said they had brought him there, not for the rings, but to recruit him for the security bureau. Shin replied that this was true, and that they had a secret organization called the Black Sun, and were training an elite strike force, and they needed Lee there. Shin offered Lee to join them, and work together with the security bureau. Lee bowed his head and thought that he was being recruited again, and again into the bureau, only with a different name, and realized that the author was persistent. He thought it was pointless, and said that he had gotten something else from the Ma family, and that she didn't need to worry about it. Lee told Shin that as an agent of the security bureau, she should just guide him. After all, he could deal with the demons of destruction on his own. Then, our hero told her it was time to go, and called Shin to follow him. Walking ahead, he He told her that the rings were nearby and thought he needed some privacy. Suddenly, the situation changed, and the author said that it might be fun, but it couldn't end so quickly. Everything around him stopped, and Lee couldn't understand what the author was doing with the plot. The author replied that if he ruined the budget, it would end up being a complete mess. He noted that Lee should have gone to the National Security Bureau and become a member of the Black Star for the action that would conquer the world. The author was a little angry and didn't understand why Lee was so deliberately refusing. He generally liked watching the main character, but he didn't like that he was interfering with the plot, and he said that this was the first warning. Fury appeared in his eyes, and he told our hero that he was the author of this novel, not Lee. At that moment, Lee asked if there was a predetermined story. The author did not understand what he meant, and Lee shouted that the author's writing was very boring. Immediately, tongues of purple flame appeared around the author, and he asked again if his works were boring. Lee realized that he shouldn't have said such things to a person of that disposition, and began to justify himself. At the same time, the author shouted that there were rumors in the novel that a secret organization of the National Security Agency was involved. Lee reminded him of the name of the novel, and said that if he went to the bureau, he would have the life of a government official, not a hero. The author noted that it all depended on Lee, and Lee said that it was difficult to be the main character, and the author immediately said that he didn't have to do it. In an instant, our hero's consciousness moved into Shin's body, which shocked him. Our hero clenched his fists in anger and confusion about what was happening to him, and told the author to calm down. Lee, in Shin's body, began to shout at the author to return him to his body immediately. The author himself also looked as if he did not understand what was happening around him. After that, the author shouted that everything was mixed up because of Lee, and that it was a real disaster. The author noted that Lee had already said that he had inherited the legend of demons, and that one cannot do such things without thinking about the consequences, but Lee was sure that he would get away with it. The author was still hysterical, not understanding how it would turn out, but our hero realized that he had returned to his own body. Lee was already calm, and looking at the author, said that he was doing well, and that unpredictability was the strongest and most charming aspect of the novel. And in order to succeed in the future, it was precisely this trait that had to be preserved. He noted that if the author didn't like how everything was turning out, he needed to sketch out the plot before releasing the chapter. But now they needed to make the most of the current situation. It was also unknown whether the story would be better if Lee joined the bureau. Lee noted that he had no reason to do so, and the author asked him to continue. At that moment, our hero realized that he was able to convince the author that he was right. He said that from now on, the world would be clearer and Lee's influence on it would be less. And then only the author would have the right to decide everything, because he was the god of this novel. At that, Lee fell silent and thought that he had explained himself as best he could, but doubts still crept into his mind as to whether the author understood his position or not. After all, they were just getting started, and nerves were inevitable. A few moments later, the author looked up at Lee and asked if their argument was over. The author took Lee by the shoulders and said that he liked our hero's words and agreed with them, and so he noted that Lee could count on his help in various situations in the future. After that, the author began to walk away and, showing our hero a heart, said that the two of them needed to work together and left. At that moment, time resumed, and Shin continued talking from where they had left off. She was angry because it was the first time she had heard that Lee had inherited the legend of demons. Shin also didn't understand why Lee told her all this, and she thought he was hinting at revenge. Lee asked if the Bureau was responsible for protecting people and ensuring a free and stable democratic society. Shin asked him why he was asking this question. Lee asked what would happen to the world if people found out about it. Shin said that the country's stability would be disrupted and a bloody battle would begin, because that's what happened every time the legend of demons appeared. That's why Lee told Shin to keep her mouth shut, because it would protect both him and the country. Shin was still puzzled. She asked why he had told her that. Lee replied that she wanted to recruit him, and he explained his refusal. Shin said that being an agent would be beneficial in the long run if she did not disclose information about Lee. She promised to keep his secret if he helped the Bureau. Lee said that he had no authority and no subordinates. Then he said that since she was now in the know, he invited Shin to join him. Lee realized he had asked her too soon and said he was joking, but if she was interested, he asked her to let him know. That way, the Bureau would be on his side. But Shin was worried that Lee might change his mind later, but he denied it. After that, Shin asked if Lee knew who was responsible for the destruction of Jeomdam. A notification came out that in May, the Princess of Destruction, Kabalia, appeared and the Osaka alliance was destroyed. Lee thought this was very timely and said that last year, a parallel world had opened in Osaka, and the Alliance teams wanted to capture it. But they failed to destroy the main demon within the set time limit, and the world exploded, and all the teams were destroyed. The demon responsible for this was called Kabalia, and she was in Ichan at the moment. Shin was terrified that the powerful demoness who used the Oga poison was here. The Oga Hell is a great demonic spell, available at the level of extermination. It is a direct manifestation of the demonic god. Shin asked Lee if he was sure he could defeat her. Lee noted that he was not going to defeat her, and that Shin was overestimating him. After all, Lee said that he was not strong enough to defeat her, and therefore planned to seal her. Defeating and sealing are not the same thing, but in any case, he asked Shin not to worry. After all, he understood that at that moment, they should be worried about the street thugs attacking them. The first thug was greeted with a kick from our hero. Lee asked Shin if a security bureau agent should be safe. She replied that she didn't say there wouldn't be any fools who would want to attack them, and one such fool appeared behind her. Our hero responded to his attack by grabbing him by the hood and knocking the knife out of his hand. Lee laughed at him and said he was too slow for a thug. After that, he asked if Shin could handle the thugs herself, since she was a real agent. He turned around and saw Shin cornering another thug and asking who said she couldn't. Shin asked the gang if they were new here, if they hadn't heard of the security bureau, because their organization would give everyone their just desserts. Hearing the words about the bureau, they ran away, and Shin called them fools for not noticing her badge. After that, Lee asked if she had another badge with the logo, and she asked if Lee was hinting that he wanted to join them, after which they moved on. Walking through this area of the city, Shin asked Lee if he knew anything about the Golden Ring of Destruction. Lee replied that he did, but he didn't have much to say about it. After all, he himself did not yet know what power these two golden rings possessed. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the author appeared, holding a piece of paper in his hands, and said that this was his exit. Memories from Li Huan's past were added to the world, such as the concept of the Golden Ring, the characters Kang Il-chan and Li Chan-jin. The concept of magic was expanded. The power of the seven-star tower was added, as well as an episode from the past, with a conflict against the tower and a new continent of magical civilization. It was a new region, and it appeared on the day of the collision of dimension. Its regions were 7 towers, symbolizing the power of the continent. Lee was horrified at how much new information the author had added in such a short time, even though Lee had asked him to just tell him about the rings. The author said that before, Kang Il-chan from the Black Star and Li Jin from the Control Guild expelled Kabalia and took possession of the rings. Li Chan-jin received the Ring of Thunder and was summoned by the magical civilization, gaining power in the kingdom of Alcade. The author mentioned that the rings would give Li a lot of power, and that it would not only concern the ring, then they would be able to obtain a real treasure. Although Li's head was splitting from all the information, he was interested in the phrase about a real treasure. At that moment, he heard Shin's voice asking him to look ahead, and Lee didn't understand what it was. Shin explained that a parallel world had opened up before them. Lee asked the author what it was, since they had planned a level of destruction. The agent asked Lee if Kabalia could be there. If so, then there were other high-level demons there as well. Shin screamed in horror that Lee hadn't mentioned that they would have to go there, but our hero was also surprised. For Shin, one extermination-level demon was too much, let alone other demons. She understood that they needed to be extremely careful. Besides, she thought that Lee couldn't handle it alone, and at that moment, he suggested getting closer to the zone. Shin followed him and mentioned that she trusted him, but she was curious how he wanted to seal a demon of that level, and if he had a clear plan. Lee replied that the Osaka Alliance team had been destroyed, but they had driven a demon of the same level out of the city. Lee said that those people had something that could withstand the flame attack. Lee also had it, which was enough to seal a weakened demon with a destruction level. Lee told her all this, but he didn't know how strong the demon was, but he decided he could handle the sealing. He decided that if he could defend himself with the crystal, and then use the blood of the heavenly demon and pressure points, he could do it. Nevertheless, he understood that he should not forget that a high-level demon from a parallel world was a formidable opponent. Lee began to enter the parallel world, and asked the author what awaited him there. When he crossed the line, he saw many dark entities around him. Now he was surrounded by sworn enemies from the past. These were the ones Lee feared before returning to the past. Various kings appeared before him. These were the kings of the way of life of the sword. All of them were Lee's sworn enemies. In addition to this, they terrified our hero. But this time Lee decided that they would switch places, and our hero realized what the words about finding treasure meant. At that moment, Shin's words about smelling something terrible brought him back from his thoughts. She suggested that the Sharpmans lived here too. Shin said that it was very dangerous here, and there were many demons, and Lee suggested that she return, to which she agreed. Our hero was very surprised by the agent's decision, and asked her about the gold rings. Shin replied that she believed Lee could seal the demon on his own, but the situation had changed. The parallel world was open, and there could be a high-level demon inside that posed a threat. And this demon posed a threat not only to Seoul, but to the entire country. Shin was sorry to miss the opportunity to get the ring, but it was better for her to prepare for the worst-case scenario. After that, the girl left the parallel world, wishing Lee good luck. The author was also surprised that Shin left, and Lee reminded him that he himself had created her that way. After that, the author said that Lee should take one thing with him, and then he threw his magnum pistol into our hero's hand. Lee himself did not understand how his weapon ended up in the author's hands, and when he picked it up. At that moment, a pack of Sharpmans attacked Lee, and he had to start shooting at them. While shooting at the Sharpmans, Lee thought that he had met his weapon again, and now felt stronger. The Sharpmans scurrying everywhere only made Lee feel irritated. Continuing to shoot, Lee realized that he needed a melee weapon, and picked up a knife from the asphalt. Now he continued to fight off these demons with both his pistol and knife. As he continued to fight them, Lee began to look around to see if the leader of the Sharpmans was there. Although he did not see him, Lee was greatly annoyed by this battle and wanted to end it quickly. Finally, he stood firmly on his feet and wiped the Sharpman's liquid off himself, thinking again about how annoying they were. Moving on and looking at the demons, he realized that their leader was not there. Suddenly, a new crowd of monsters jumped out at Lee, and he shouted in despair, wondering when they would all go to the other world. Lee decided that he needed to find a way to just blow them all up. But then he noticed that they weren't crossing the line of the playground he had entered. And then our hero heard a girl's voice right behind him. She said that this was her playground, and the Sharpmans would never enter it. Lee couldn't understand what was going on around him, so he asked her about it. Near the swing, he saw a guy from the Devil Clan in a parallel world, and he wasn't alive. The girl got off the swing and said that he really wasn't alive because she was hungry. Looking at her, Lee realized that she was the very demon with the level of extermination. She wasn't weak, just small. The girl looked up at him and replied sweetly that Lee knew who she was. After that, she was surprised that he wasn't trembling and was pretending to be brave. After she was expelled, she became young to save her life, so she could return to her original form. Now she was curious about Lee's name. She looked at him and asked if our hero would tell her his name. Lee understood that something was wrong because he couldn't move. After that, Kabalia asked Lee again what our hero's name was. Lee repeated in his head that the demon was interested in his name, and she kept repeating the questions. Our hero decided that she was doing this to make his soul tastier for her. In addition, with these questions, she was influencing his mind. At that moment, she was already behind him and whispered the question in his ear. She seemed to hypnotize our hero by repeating this phrase over and over again. Lee fell to his knees in despair and realized that he must not give in. It was obvious that if he said his name, it would be the end of him. But our hero could not help himself and still said his name, and the demoness repeated it. She said that now, Lee must give her his life, and she would take his soul. Lee wondered if his life was important to him, since he existed in the world of the novel, and his life here was like a short journey. He was ashamed that he had met Kabalia like this. But then he heard the author's voice calling him to wake up. The author couldn't believe that Lee would fall for this psychological attack. For Lee, the author's cries were just background noise, and he couldn't make out the words. But he was confused that because of him, he couldn't hear Kabalia. Suddenly, Lee said the name Leah, which also made the demoness curious. Lee said that Leah sounded better, and he wanted to call her that. He asked her to remember him as the one who called her that. The demoness agreed, and said she would remember him that way. She decided that Lee was amusing. Then she reached out her hand to Lee and said she would take his soul, and he said she was in danger. Lee said that the security bureau knew she was here, and would soon come to send her to the other world, and Lee really didn't want that. Lee continued to say that Leah would die at the hands of his strike force, and that she could not escape her fate. He added that her death was a necessity, and that they had come up with it all with the author, and that it was cruel. After that, our hero handed her the rebirth watch and asked her to take it. Kabelia was angered by this and threw the watch out of Lee's hand, saying that he had gone mad. She maliciously ordered our hero to point the magnum at himself. Lee looked at her and said that he still had a lot to tell her. Finally, he asked her to promise him just one thing. Pointing the gun at himself, he asked her to go to a safe place. But Kabelia did not listen to his words and ordered him to send himself to the other world. Lee thought it was a short meeting that took up a few lines, and he should be glad that he was able to be the main character for a short time. He said goodbye to the demoness Leia and thanked the author for the story. After that, the world began to collapse because he mentioned the author in the conversation and said that Leia's death was a necessity. But suddenly our hero returned to the moment when he was fighting the Sharpmans. Since he had just regained consciousness, he did not understand what had happened. Defending himself from the Sharpmans, Lee thought that his mind had succumbed to that mental attack, and the author said that was indeed the case. The The author was sad that Lee had not even tried to listen to him at the time, and Lee replied that he had no choice. But the author liked it when Lee immersed himself in the role of the protagonist, and such moments made him happy. But the author did not understand how the attack affected Lee, and our hero did not understand what the author meant by immersion in the role. Then the author decided that he needed more time to explain, so he snapped his fingers and stopped time. The author clarified that Lee's eyes changed color when he acted of his own free will, and it was strange that Lee did not know about the roles. But the author summed up that he was glad he saved Lee then, because he was in an incomprehensible state. The author explained that he called it self-sacrifice, and then Lee's eyes turned brown. Then Lee ignores the author and becomes Lee Huan. Our hero then understood where his memory problems came from. After that, the author asked Lee not to forget his words, and left. At that moment, time was restored, and Lee noted that the author had once again done as he pleased. Lee told the author not to worry, because it would not happen again. Our hero quickly destroyed the Sharpmans, because now he knew where his target was and could stay focused. In addition, the author gave Lee some grenades for this battle, to make it easier for him. Our hero also understood that this time, he had to deal with Kabelia before she hypnotized him. After a series of explosions, Lee spotted her on the platform and asked if she was hungry. Immediately after that, he threw the burning Sharpman's body at the swing. Kabelia was surprised that Lee knew who she was and acknowledged his bravery. Then, just like last time, she asked our hero his name. Lee didn't understand why she was so powerful, even though she didn't look it, and he was curious why the author wanted them to fight. He immediately realized that he couldn't concentrate because of these thoughts in his head. His thoughts were that his opponent was at the destruction level, and she was not at her peak. And while Lee was thinking that he needed to pull himself together, Kabelia flew up to him and asked who he was talking to, and told him to give his name. And again, she resorted to hypnotizing her opponent, asking him to give his name. Our hero's eyes changed color, and he began to say, but without saying his last name, Lee said that Leah wouldn't fool him a second time. After that, Lee lunged forward to wound Kabelia with his fist. She didn't understand what was happening, and called it devilry, adding that she didn't know any Leah. Taking a gun out of his pocket, our hero said that it was her name, and that she liked it last time, which angered her. After firing, she began to examine the playground to see if she had hit our hero. But he was not on the playground, and he immediately appeared behind her and told her so. Then our hero shot at her and landed on the floor at the same moment. She caught the bullet in her palm and said that it definitely wouldn't work on her. Lee realized that he needed to try something else, then put the gun back in his belt. Lee attacked her hand to hand, saying that this was only the beginning. Our hero thought that using magic and his hands would be the best tactic for fighting her. The demoness defended herself from his fists with magic circles that she placed in front of her. With the help of circles and fire, she wanted to increase the distance between them, and Lee had to become faster. He needed to become not just faster, but several times faster to catch up with her, and he shouted at Lee to stop running away. Being close to her, Lee realized that he should use the seventh form to win. He broke Kabelia's magic circle, and she realized that with this body, she could not oppose him. But she remembered the hellish flame, and still hesitated to use it. Nevertheless, she didn't think for long and told Lee that she wouldn't just stand there and take his attacks. Then Kabelia shouted that she wouldn't lose to someone like our hero. After that, she directed her hellish flame towards our hero. Our hero stood motionless, watching the flames fly towards him. Before the flames touched him, he transformed his inner strength. Immediately after that, with another gesture, our hero strengthened his body. He used the technique of the 12 pressure points of the heavenly mouse. This was combined with the technique of the 12 pressure points of the heavenly demon snake. He transformed the lotus meditation technique into the pure inner strength meditation technique. And having done all this, our hero came to the third form of the heavenly demon palm technique. And now this demonic heavenly palm opposed the hellish fire of Kabelia. And at that time, she continued to direct fire at our hero, saying that she would never lose. After a couple of moments, all the fire went out, and Kabelia began to search for our hero with her eyes. Not finding him, she looked up and saw a glow, and did not understand what it was. In the next moment, a huge palm began to drive her into the ground. After that, our hero suddenly grabbed her by the throat and lifted her limp body above the ground. After a few moments, the demoness dissolved into golden sparkles in his hand. Instead, 2 golden rings appeared before our hero. Li Huan grabbed one in his palm, and it recognized its master and began to take on a new form. A beautiful golden sword appeared in his hand, and Li named it the Thunder Sword. It was an incomparable sword made from a golden ring. The power of lightning flowed through the blade, increasing the power of the sword itself. While Li was examining his new sword, the author appeared, who was just as happy. The author asked him what Li was going to do with the other ring. Li himself did not understand what to do, and the author decided that it would be unbalanced to make both rings strong, and the second one would be useless. The author suggested several options for the ring's abilities, including reviving a beetle and removing the smell of excrement, among others. Li said they were useless, and the author said that was the point, and that he shouldn't come up with any more skills. Li decided to choose from the ones available. He decided to choose the option to remove the smell, and the author decided it was pointless. But our hero said that what is trash to one person is treasure to another. Such skills can be killers who hide their presence, because even they cannot completely control their bodies. Next, the author began to think about what to call the second ring, considering that the first was a thunder sword. Then the author thought for a moment, and told Li that he had decided to call the ring Deodorant. Li liked the name, and the author clarified that he had always been good at coming up with names. He even felt proud, and now understood why collectors collect things. Li turned to the author, and hoped that he enjoyed coming up with names and functions for treasures, and the author realized that Li liked it too. But our hero pointed to his head, and said that he liked what was in his head better. At that moment, Kabelia was screaming inside, trying to find someone. But very soon she realized that it was Li's plan for her to use the hellish flames and exhaust herself. It turned out that, without knowing it, she had fallen into his trap. As a result, in her rage, she screamed and promised to send Li to the other world. At that moment, the author asked Li if he was going to go out on the streets of the city looking like that. Our hero was naked from the waist up, and asked what was wrong with his appearance, and the author pointed it out. At that moment, Li began to look for some clothes on the floor, getting dirtier in the process. When the author pointed out again that he was naked, he replied that the best part of his wardrobe was himself. But the author said he would not allow Li to walk around like that, and snapped his fingers. In the next moment, Li was wearing a classic suit with a bow tie. Li was happy about this, and said that he could do anything he wanted in this outfit, but the author thought the suit was too extravagant. So he snapped his fingers again, and the suit changed to more casual clothes. The author said that this style was better, and suited Li more, and at that moment, our hero yelled at him to shut up. The author thought that Li was talking to him, but he said that he was talking to Kabelia in his head. The demoness continued to scream and thrash around hysterically, not understanding where she was. Suddenly, when she screamed that she was cold, a blanket fell on her head, and Li's voice said that she was in the chambers of his mind, in a sealed room. No creature could extract her, only Li could do it. Extermination could not object to him and cause him harm. Kabelia still didn't understand if this was part of Li's plan from the beginning, and she asked Li to show himself. Li said he was right in front of her, and she just had to press the button on the side. Suddenly, the light came on, and our hero stood in front of Leia in a small room, measuring 10 square meters. Kabelia screamed that Li was a bastard for locking her in this place. She tried to attack our hero, shouting for him to let her out, but Li said she might never leave this place. He told her to finally give up, because he was not going to let her out of here. Since she protected Li from all mental attacks, he said he needed her, because Li was about to face the King of Laws. He was considered a master of mental attack, and was strong in summoning and transformation. Now Li knew that before fighting him, the King of Laws would have to deal with extermination. But Kabelia was not satisfied with this, and began to scream for Li to release her immediately, because she did not want to live in this room. At that moment, Li asked her to wait a little, and left his subconscious. While she was asking what Li was going to do and where he had gone, our hero examined the Thunder Sword, realizing that it was a great treasure. Li was glad that he had managed to test it on the Sharpman before the portal closed. Besides, our hero had certain plans for these monsters. Li threw them into his subconscious, remembering that Leah had complained of hunger. The first thing Kabelia said was that she didn't eat such demons. But after a couple of moments, she began to eat as if nothing had happened. Seeing this, Li decided that she liked everything, even though it all looked strange. Nevertheless, our hero came to the conclusion that he had successfully captured the extermination that would be his sword and shield. And now he would be able to use deodorant to defeat the Dark Lord. And he judged from the recent battle that the Thunder Sword was indeed a powerful weapon. Everything was as it should be, and Li decided that only the main character from the past could possess possess such artifacts. Besides, he would have enough money for as much soup as he wanted. The author told Lee that he was too obsessed with soup, but Lee replied that the author himself had made him that way. Suddenly, Lee noticed that his watch was missing from his wrist, and his dark core and gun were also gone, and the author was surprised that Lee had only just noticed. Lee then suggested that the hellfire had destroyed them, and he didn't understand why he had done all this if he had lost them. Lee had literally gone through hell for these things, and was therefore diligently trying to find them. At that moment, he was distracted by Kabelia's voice in his head, asking if he wanted her help. She didn't know what he was looking for, but she decided she could help. After all, she figured that one head is good, but two are even better. While Lee was just starting to look for his things, Kabelia sat in the room and finished eating the demon. So that she wouldn't be so bored after she ate, she began to examine the room. And now she did it in more detail, touching the sheet in someone's subconscious. Breathing in and out, she realized that everything around her was imagination. And the world around her was created by someone's specific will who wanted to drag her here. On an instinctive level, she understood and felt that she would not be able to get out of there. She also imagined all the higher demons she had ever met, and she realized that even the great Rohamaran himself would not be able to get out of there. And they would only do so if Li Huan himself wanted it. This fact made her furious, and she felt the urge to tear Li to pieces. But there was only one way to get out of this place, so she offered him her help. But Lee didn't understand where his things had disappeared to. He fell into despair when he realized that looking for his things here was like looking for a needle in a haystack. And what annoyed our hero most was that he was wasting his precious time on this. At that moment, Kabelia was already yelling that she could help Lee. He asked her not to shout and went into the room to ask how she was going to help. Kabelia replied that if he freed her, she would definitely find what Lee had lost. Lee thought she was mocking him and that there was no point in doing it and was about to leave. But Leah shouted that he could bring her back at any moment, and that piqued his interest. She was incredibly angry at herself for having to say it, but she understood that only she could save herself, and she had to tell Lee that she could split her soul into several pieces, and she was going to give one of those pieces to our hero irrevocably. It was difficult to obtain a fragment of the soul because it became a powerful pledge and seal. Only a high-ranking demon with the blood of an empress could do this. If a demon did so, he swore to share his fate with his partner and became bound by ties stronger than marriage. Leah understood that she did not know how she would get her soul fragment back or how she would get out of prison, but she felt that the man in front of her was destined for a great future and that he would be able to radically influence the whole world. And besides, she would learn the whole truth about the world, and then she would be able to figure out how to get out of this cage. It was then that she broke off the horn from her head, which contained a part of her soul, and couldn't believe that Lee had become her Estella. After that, she threw the horn at our hero and told him to take it and add the concept of Estella to the world. Having received the fragment of Kabelia's soul, Lee asked if he was now her Estella. At that moment, the author asked Lee if he wanted her to become his heroine instead of Shin. Lee told the author not to dare do such a thing, and the author noted that she may look like a child, but in fact, she is already an adult. Having become Kabelia's Estella, he could release her spirit into the street, and now she was helping him in his search for the core. Looking at her, Lee wondered if everything would be all right, because now she looked like a little child, although Lee was sure that her original form was completely different. At that moment, Lee was distracted from his thoughts about the adult Kabelia by her cry that she had found the core. It lay under the rubble of concrete, and Lee asked if this was what our hero was looking for. Lee was delighted that she had managed to find the core, and said that she deserved the status of destruction. Leah was surprised that Lee had expected something weaker, and asked what they should look for next. Lee explained that next was the drink of life and death in the clock, which, although broken, contains something important. Our hero explained that inside was a treasure from the world of martial arts, with the same effect as an elixir. Leah said that was surprising for an idiot, and Lee pointed out that it was inappropriate for her to call her Ishtar that. After that, Kabelia started chasing Lee and shouting that she would punish him, mixing up the author. While they were searching, the author read the comments under the latest chapters. He liked to comment and therefore answered all questions, even those not related to the plot, such as the level of development of the races. The author also noted in the comments that Kabelia would be present in the further narrative. A lot of time had passed, but Lee and Leah couldn't find what they needed. Our hero looked at Kabelia and thought that she was completely exhausted. After all, she was exhausted when he caught her, and now she had gone through a battle, signing a contract, sealing it, and searching for a drink. So Lee suggested that she rest and return to her room. He added that he would call her if he needed her, and she immediately disappeared. Moving to her room, she immediately fell asleep on the floor, covered with a blanket. Lee got up and decided that he needed to find the drink before the 10th chapter began. Suddenly, he saw a notification that the first paragraph of the 10th chapter had begun. Lee was surprised that it was so fast, and immediately felt the trigger of a gun behind his back. A few moments later, the gun fired at our hero's back. As the bullet flew toward our hero, he realized he wouldn't be able to dodge it in time. However, he could simply melt it in the air with the protective energy of heavenly fire. The author noted that this was a good idea, and was curious to see how Lee would resist modern weapons. And for Lee, it was surprising that the author had not yet written this into the rules of the world. After that, our hero asked the person who shot him a question. He wanted to know whose doing it was. Suddenly, he realized that it was one of the members of the Dark Star gang. Before regressing, Lee had met one of them, and now the soldier looked exactly like a member of the gang. After Lee realized this, the shootout did not end, but only gained momentum. But all the bullets flew past Lee, and he shouted to the soldier that this would not work on him. Lee noticed that the enemy was keeping an optimal distance so that he could not reach him with his martial arts skill. A few moments later, the soldier changed his ammunition and began firing demonic bullets. Our hero was surprised that the soldier was so willing to use such expensive ammunition. The protective energy could not perfectly defend against the demonic bullets, and Lee had to stop using it and focus on recovery. Our hero had no choice but to get closer to the soldier in order to defeat him for sure. Lee threw away the soldier's melee weapon and clamped his hand around his neck. Pinning him to the ground, Lee said that he was doing this because the soldier had attacked him first, and, according to the rules of martial arts, he was defending himself. At that moment, Lee looked up and found himself surrounded by a crowd of similar soldiers. Looking around, our hero realized that there were at least 2 squads of assault troops around him, and probably snipers as well. The author noted that it was impossible to resist the snipers, and Lee asked if he was doing this on purpose to annoy him. Then our hero heard a question from behind him, asking why he didn't just surrender. This question was asked by Kang Il-chan, the deputy head of the security bureau, whose real identity was a dark star. And this man asked our hero to explain his relationship with the extermination. This question stumped our hero, because he didn't expect it. After a while in the room, our hero considered the essence of the call from the parallel world. At this time, the restored smartwatch created by Professor Wig, by transforming the drink of life and death, adorned his wrist. Lee sat on his phone in the bank app and looked at his account of about 100 billion won. His phone also had a notification about a medal for bravery from the Kingdom of Golden Spring. Lee could use the services of an entire state for free. At that moment, he was in the VIP room at Cheongil Hospital. At the same time, the author finished the article in which he corrected what had gone wrong, but turned out well in the end. Lee hoped that the author had really corrected everything in the chapter, and that there were even action scenes, which meant that everything would be fine. It was funny that the thought occurred to Lee that he should have fought Kang. Kang couldn't get that thought out of his head, and they were thinking about the same thing. Then, in Incheon, Kang said that there had been a misunderstanding, and that they had rushed because they didn't expect Lee to take over the extermination. They thought Lee was under her spell, but Lee said it didn't matter, and that he forgave them. Nevertheless, Kang said that he did not like the tone with which he spoke to him. But our hero did not respond to this, and turned away to go in search of something. The whole group also joined in the search for something they themselves did not know. After a while, Lee found what he was looking for, and said that the more hands, the easier it would be. Kang asked him what it was, and if he had found the trophy after defeating the extermination. Lee replied that it was not that, but a gift from Turg and Professor Vega from the Kingdom of Golden Spring. Kang was surprised by this, and then Lee asked to be taken to the Cheongil Hospital, where he wanted to meet with Turg. Kang was shocked that Lee, one of the 3 most influential people in the kingdom, knew 2 of them, and could meet with them whenever he wanted. It had been less than 3 days since he became famous, and he couldn't understand what Lee was doing. But there was a more important question. Kang didn't understand who Lee really was, but Kang decided not to show it, and at the same time, sent a message to stop all investigations into the case of Li Huan. After all, it could lead to diplomatic problems with the Kingdom of Golden Spring, since Li was connected to it. At that moment, Kang understood that it was impossible to enter into direct confrontation with Lee. Kang understood that everything was complicated by the fact that Lee had the support of the Kingdom of Golden Spring. At the same time, in our hero's head, Kabalia continued to scream desperately from hunger. And Lee realized that with each journey, he had more and more hungry mouths to feed, and he needed to find demons to feed Lee. The author turned to Lee and said that their 10th chapter had ended too smoothly, and asked for advice for the future. Lee noted that this was a problem for all authors, because starting a new story arc was not so easy. But he asked the author not to worry about, because he had a cunning main character. At that moment, Lee made a phone call and said he was looking for someone. This person's name was Kim Min-jun. He was 14 years old. He worked as a porter, and he was born in Icheon. Considering that he was a handyman, Lee assumed that he did not belong to any guild. Therefore, it was easiest to find him in the ordinary labor market. The author wrote down the information for Lee in detail and noted that they were discussing the recruitment of talent. The author himself wrote that Lee began to restore the heavenly demon sect and recruit his followers from the past. After some time, the author and Lee were riding on a train, and the author asked if Kim must have an interesting past. Our hero hadn't thought about it, and at that moment, he received a text message from Shin with a photo of the blood sect at his doorstep. Lee replied to Shin that he was fine and that she could go home and rest because someone would take care of them. The author continued to ponder whether they could make Kim a disciple of one of Lee's enemies, or, conversely, make him a hero. Lee noted that the first option overlapped with the arc of the ancient dragon's sword, and the second was, in his opinion, boring. Then the author suggested making him a crazy villain who committed a terrible massacre, and Lee liked this option. Lee came up with the idea that he would be a mad demon who made the world tremble. The author listened to our hero and decided that this was exactly what he would do. But then he wondered if our hero would be able to defeat him, and Lee decided to recruit him before he completely lost his mind. So he and the author wrote the backstory of the mad demon whose name was Kim. He raged for less than a year, but the fear he instilled was immeasurable. In Muram, this demon killed a martial arts master, whose nickname was King, and in the fantasy world, he single-handedly defeated the dark archmage Diarch, and no one knew what exactly drove him mad. But if he had lived a normal life and not lost his mind, he would have become a genius who joined the ranks of the great Buddhist monks. However, in his previous life, Li Huan had never met the mad demon, because he began his activities after Li Huan's death. But as soon as Li Huan saw the boy, he immediately realized that this was the mad demon of this era. He realized this when he saw a small tattoo under his eye that matched the one Lee had seen in the records. Looking at him in the crowd, Lee realized that this boy was the mad demon. At that moment, the boy was trying to break through the security at one men's school into a parallel world. But the guards stopped him, and the military yelled at him, asking where he was going, because you need a command to pass. The boy replied that he wasn't going to enter the parallel world, and just wanted to run around. The guards yelled that Kim was lying, and at that moment, Lee asked if they were being too rough with the child. After saying this, our hero left the crowd, pretending to be very cool, and people began to recognize him. The crowd chanted that they did not expect to see Lee here, as he had recently defeated a powerful demon. The guards recognized Lee and said that he looked good and asked what brought him to Jeonju and if he was going to attend school. Lee noted that he had no reason to come to this place for other reasons. Lee asked them what was going on with the boy. The officer replied that at first glance, it seemed that they were too strict with him, but that was because the boy was from the Econ district, and there was no need to worry about him because he was disobedient and ill-mannered. He was notorious in Jeonju, but he was smart because he had not been arrested yet. Lee asked the officers if he could deal with him himself, and this stunned the soldier. Approaching the boy, Lee thought about how he had been treated so harshly all his life, and that was precisely why he would go mad and commit murder. At that moment, Kim shouted at Lee, asking if he had ever seen anyone being beaten, and asked him not to meddle in other people's business. Our hero realized that he was being rude and was always on his guard. After that, Lee pointed to the school and asked if he wanted to go there, but the boy did not answer. Nevertheless, Lee understood that Kim was still a child who was trying to protect himself by any means necessary, and Lee asked if Kim wanted to go with him. This child already had many scars, and Lee asked why the author had made him so pitiful. The next moment, Kim hit our hero quite hard with his head. After that, he started to run away, shouting that he was not stupid and did not need Lee. Looking after him, our hero realized that he was too proud, even though Lee knew it would not be easy, but he had to win him over somehow. The author said that Lee needed to think about it, and he would try to come up with a story for One Men Elementary School in the meantime. At the same time, our hero asked the author not to overdo it again, because now it was about recruiting Kim. The author asked Lee not to worry, because he had already thought of everything. Then, the author began to come up with possible dangers for the school, and Lee realized that he had a bad feeling about it. At that moment, our hero heard a woman's voice addressing him. A girl approached him and asked if he was Li Huan, the rising star. She noted that she was pleased to meet our hero. It was Lee Sumi, the 49-year-old guildmaster of the Forest Guild. She was a student of Megrid, one of the guardians of the Seven-Star Tower. Lee himself was shocked that the girl standing in front of him was 49 years old, and he asked her who she was. It was clear from Sumi's face that she was upset that Lee did not know her. Lee then learned that she could create potions and considered it a good skill. Sumi thought Lee was funny because he asked if he should know who she was and said that he would soon find out everything. Then she turned around and said to our hero that she would find Lee later and left. People began to whisper about this meeting, and Lee realized that she was quite famous. At that moment, something exploded behind the school, and Lee realized that the raid might be more difficult than he had expected. At the same time, hiding behind a pillar, Kim thought that he shouldn't have been so cocky. He was running out of money, and Kim realized that he definitely needed to get into the raid, and that it would be better to accept Lee's offer. However, the boy considered our hero too suspicious, and thought that Lee had found out about his past, and wanted to use him as a porter. After all, everyone had forced him to do dirty work before, thinking they could pay him cheaply, and in the end, they didn't even pay him. But this time, Kim was determined to join the raid. The next moment, his train of thought was interrupted by Li Huan's question about whether Kim was still there. Li told him that he had heard that everyone was going to school tomorrow, but upon hearing this, the boy rushed forward. Our hero grabbed him by the strap of his backpack, and the boy responded by yelling at Lee to let him go. But Lee ignored him and just asked if he wanted to go with him for some gukbap. When they arrived at the cafe, Kim was very loud and uncontrollable, yelling that they still hadn't brought him an extra gukbap. In addition, the boy was very proud and did whatever he wanted, and it would be difficult to win his trust. Deciding to improve Kim's trust, Lee asked him if he was really from Incheon. Kim shouted that Lee now regretted buying him food, and that even though he behaved like an adult, he shouldn't have done so. But our hero did not fall for the provocation, and asked Lee if Diark believed that Kim was in the afterlife. Then the author appeared, and remembered that Diark was a dark magician, whom a mad demon had sent to the afterlife in a previous life. Lee had heard that Diark kidnapped children, and conducted experiments on them, so Lee asked if Kim was one of them, and how he managed to escape. Diark was a dark magician in Econ, who ruled the lawless zone, conducting experiments on children, and was nicknamed the Rat Catcher. Listening to this story, the author now understood why the mad demon had destroyed Diark, and he liked the story and its meaning. Kim did not understand what Lee was trying to say, although he was sure that Lee was not Diark's messenger. Lee asked the boy if he really wanted revenge, and if Kim needed help with that. Lee said that he had been treated the same way before, so he knew well how Kim wanted to take revenge on those who had hurt him. The boy didn't ask any stupid questions, and only asked what the catch was. Lee asked why there should be a catch, and Kim replied that Lee had appeared out of nowhere and was offering to go on a raid, treating him and offering help. The boy understood that no one would do this for him for no reason, so he asked what Lee wanted in return. Lee replied that Kim shouldn't flatter himself, and that he wasn't doing it for him. Lee said he couldn't talk about his own benefit, but he also had goals. Lee thought he couldn't tell Kim that he would become a mad demon. Kim didn't expect much from Lee, but he knew that people like our hero had hidden motives, and he didn't care about them. He just wanted revenge. But he asked if Lee was too confident, because even though he was a rising star, it was unclear how he would be able to stand up to Diark with his skills. Lee told Kim that he would show him everything the next day during the raid. Then he would be able to see for himself what our hero was capable of, and whether he could handle Diark. Lee said there would be a raid tomorrow, and that he would take Kim as a porter, adding that Kim had nothing to lose. The next day, there were a lot of people in the square in front of the school, and Lee counted about 500. Looking around, he realized that such a large number of people was beyond the norm, and our hero realized that with this chapter, Mr. Author had really gone all out. At that moment, inside his head, Kabalia called him and warned him that this place was full of distortions and that he should be careful. She told him to avoid the statues in the science room, the music room, and even the bathroom. Kabalia added that there were many things in the school that children were afraid of, and they could be found in all places where fear originated. Lee replied that he was deeply touched that she was so concerned about her Estella. Then he told her not to worry, because he was sure it wasn't that dangerous, since the chapter was about recruiting a demon. Just then, Kim came up and handed Lee an application to participate in the raid, which had the number of the team they had been assigned to. Lee patted Kim on the head, and Kim yelled at Lee not to touch his hair. At that moment, they announced loudly that they were beginning their briefing for the raid on the parallel world of Wanmen Elementary School. The next moment, Sumi came out and asked everyone to listen to a short announcement before the raid began. This parallel world contained many other worlds within itself, and as she spoke, Lee realized what she meant when she said they would meet. The school grounds were a large parallel world, and each classroom in the main building had its own world. Sumi said that they would be divided into two teams. The first would be the Alpha team, which would start on the second floor, and the Beta team would start on the fifth floor. Sumi also introduced herself as the captain of the first Alpha team. She then said that Park Il-sun from the Three Heavens sect would be the captain of the second team, Beta. When they entered, everyone would need to carefully follow their captain's instructions. Further instructions would be given after the difficulty level was determined. Sumi then clarified that someone had unexpectedly joined their raid yesterday. That person was none other than the rising star, Li Huan, who had defeated a demon of the extermination level. The crowd began to whisper that Li had defeated the demon in Econ. The captain of the Beta team wondered if he was really as good as Sumi said he was, because there was a child standing next to him. Sumi mentioned that they didn't usually accept people from nowhere, but they decided to make an exception for Li. Li was also assigned to the Beta team. Our hero thought it was a nice gesture on Sumi's part, but she put him in an awkward position. After that, Sumi shouted that they could start entering the school, and so began the raid inside the parallel world of Wanmen Elementary School. When they entered the building, Li was greeted by Park Il-sun, the leader of the Beta team. They introduced themselves to each other and shook hands. They were supposed to maintain a respectful relationship, but Park's thoughts about Li were far from respectful. He wondered if he could really defeat the extermination, as he found it hard to believe. He was also surprised that Li had come on the raid with the test subject, Diarca. Park thought Li had come here just to make money, but he decided that Li would get nothing. However, he said aloud that he was glad to meet him. While saying pleasant words to Li, Pak had thoughts in his head that Li would get nothing. Li didn't care about his words at all, and Pak was free to do whatever he wanted. After this short dialogue, Pak said that they needed to go up to the fifth floor. When Li and Kim started climbing the stairs, the boy said that Li was very careless, and it was unclear why he wasn't nervous. After all, it was important to remain vigilant everywhere, even though there were no demons in the corridor. No one knew what could happen in a parallel world. Li noted that Kim was afraid, even though he hadn't shown it before. Kim denied that he was afraid of anything, but reminded Li that they had both heard Sumi's words. Kim recalled her words in the square and said that a mage's intuition was never wrong. Before her speech, Sumi approached Li and pretended to be very happy to see them. Li, in turn, did not understand why she was acting as if they were old friends. In addition, she began to pester Kim and touch him. Kim did not like this, and quite boldly removed her hand from his head. Sumi did not expect such a reaction to her action, and said in surprise that Kim knew how to talk and deserved a reward for it. The boy started shouting that she was the first to touch his head, but Li interrupted him and said he would deal with his porter, asking him to restrain himself. Sumi asked if our hero was protecting a member of his team. Li began to get annoyed by the situation, and he thought that Sumi was too sarcastic. But at that moment, Park distracted her, telling her that they had to get started. At that moment, she smiled sharply and shouted to the crowd not to lose their team spirit and wished them luck. After that, she turned to Li and told him to be careful. She had a bad feeling about this place, and came up to him to tell him so. Now Li was nervous that Leah and Sumi had warned him, and both said that it was dangerous here. But he told Kim not to worry, because he would be fine if he stayed close to him. Finally, they approached the first office on the 5th floor, and Park called everyone and said that they were going inside. After that, the whole crowd began to enter the parallel world of this classroom. When they entered the classroom, they realized that it was just a huge classroom with giant things in it. Then someone noticed that a milky-colored drop was falling on them from above, which suddenly exploded. When the drop fell on the face of one of the raid participants, he shouted that it was acid. After that, people noticed that something was waiting for them on the table, and Pak shouted for everyone not to panic and to line up. Kim shouted at Li not to stand there and to run for cover quickly, but our hero told the boy to watch himself carefully. He jumped high into the air and then began to perform his signature 7 sword strikes. After that, he took advantage of the descent of the White Thunder sword. A few moments before, Li saw that there were a great many sharpshooters on the table, and the author noted that he had chosen a milky concept for them. These sharpmans possessed a caustic, milk-colored substance, and when they attacked, they produced poison, and when threatened, they exploded their bodies. Realizing this, our hero told the author that he had made some pretty strong milk. Kabalia screamed in his head that they looked appetizing, and she wanted Li to kill them and give them to her. Li asked her to wait a moment. Li understood that at that moment, when he had the Thunder Sword, he had to use it for its intended purpose. And after that, he began his usual 7 strikes with the first movement. This sword strike was so powerful that it sent all the sharpshooters to the other world. Leah was unhappy that all the sharpshooters had been burned by Li's attack. The author immediately appeared and said that he had made the sword too powerful, and Lee asked if he wanted to weaken it, and the author thought about it. The next moment, the author disappeared, and Lee was really afraid that he would weaken the sword. At that moment, a crowd ran up to him, admiring his victory over the sharpshooters. People told him that they admired Lee's skill, which they had only heard about. Everyone admired our hero's sword, saying that with his skills, he could be called the Eastern Dragon. Even Kim looked at him with great surprise, asking how he had become so strong. Lee turned to him and asked if he had seen it all with his own eyes. The boy did not have time to answer, but shouted that there was a bunch of sharpmans behind Lee. At that moment, Pak used his third devastating sword and began to fight them off. Pak shouted to the others to focus on attacking the sharpmans because they were in the heat of battle. In addition, they needed to create a line of defense. At that moment, Lee reached into Kim's backpack and said he needed to give him something. Then Lee took a magnum out of the backpack and gave it to Kim, saying that he needed to defend himself with it because he should have a decent weapon. Having said that, Lee ran forward into the thick of the battle, saying that it was time for him to go there. Before starting to fight again, Lee took the sword out of its sheath and realized that it had stopped shooting lightning bolts. The author immediately appeared and said that he had simply turned it off because it was too powerful, so he changed the sword's settings a little. The sword's settings were updated, and now the lightning decreased with use, and the sword needed to be recharged. But the battle continued, and Lee had to intervene just as the Sharpman's leader attacked Pak. Lee immediately appeared and fired a burst of automatic fire at the Sharpmans, then activated the 7 unchanging sword strikes. With these step-by-step strikes, he continued to strike only their leader. Ultimately, these strikes caused the Sharpman's leader to fall apart. Lee was left holding his core and announced to Pak that he had dealt with their leader. Someone from the crowd said that this is why the world of martial arts is like an iceberg. Another replied that there are wonders in the world, but they had only recently learned about Lee. Nevertheless, his technique of 7 unchanging sword strikes was much stronger than he had heard. But neither of these people understood who the child who had come with Li Huan was. She was a magician and didn't understand why Lee had brought him along, since he was only getting in the way. The girl approached Kim and said that no matter how much she thought about it, there was no reason to take him to the battlefield. Looking closely at him, she decided that the reason was that there was something special about the boy. She began to look at him more closely and saw a strange aura around. Noticing something bad, she was about to attack him and thought she would get rid of him right there. But before she could strike, Lee kicked her aside. Lee yelled at Kim, telling him to get his act together and not to hang around on the battlefield like that. But the boy replied that he was completely focused because Lee had told him to watch himself. After listening to the boy, Lee looked at the girl and wondered why she had attacked Kim. An explanation appeared, saying that she understood the boy's condition because he had taken the first step to enter the Moon Palace. For martial artists, the Moon Palace is a place that opens the way to the zenith level. For magicians, reaching the moon was the first mandatory step they had to take to control mana, and without talent, it was impossible to get there. However, Kim managed to get there just by watching Lee's action. At that moment, she realized that Kim was too talented because it had taken her more than 5 years to get there. She realized that with such talent, this boy would surpass her in less than a year. Thus, she would simply create a rival who would threaten her status. On top of everything else, Kim gave her a bad, ominous feeling, so she decided to send him to the other world to hide him from her master's gaze. After reading this, Lee asked with a stony face if she was going to send his porter to the other world. The girl screamed that this was complete nonsense and that Lee had no proof of it. Our hero grabbed her by the throat and lifted her up, and she whispered that as a rising star, he could not afford such actions. She added that she was Sumi's student, but Lee replied that it didn't change anything. Lee said that Kim was the same person as her, and how jealous she must have been of the child's talent, that she was going to destroy him. He noted that even though she thought he was different, he wasn't born with this energy. Lee explained that this energy was an unwanted result of Kim's experience of Diarch's disgusting magical experiments. And after that, she tried to take his life with her own hands. At that moment, a guy approached Lee from behind and said that it was time for him to stop because everyone was looking at him. But Lee asked him not to interfere in his personal affairs. The guy then clarified that she was Captain Sumi's student and that making a mountain out of a molehill would cause even more problems. Lee asked the guy if he should just let this girl go when she tried to destroy one of his people. At that moment, Kim joined the conversation and said that even though she tried to do it, everything turned out fine. Besides, he was fine, and she was far from the first to try to do that. In the end, Kim said he hadn't asked for help, and that Lee shouldn't make a mountain out of a molehill. Lee let go of the girl's neck and said that Kim could have it his way. But approaching the boy, Lee asked him to give him a chance to clarify one thing. Lee told Kim that he was now his man, and not some pathetic brat. The author was ecstatic about the scene that had just taken place. There were refreshing action scenes followed by a cool quote, and Lee even acknowledged the talent of the young mad demon. This affected the novel's rating, which rose and moved them to 14th place. The comments were full of praise, and Lee was pleased that it was his doing. The author was simply basking in the pleasant comment, and Lee hoped that everything would continue to go well for them if the author believed in him. In addition, Lee now understood what it meant to be completely immersed in the moment, and our hero also realized that he had become attached to the boy. While Lee was pondering his feelings, the author continued to sincerely rejoice in the novel's success. Lee noticed this, but decided not to spoil the author's mood and not to interfere with his joy. At that moment, the author saw a negative comment saying that Lee was too strong and that it would be boring to follow him in the future. Nevertheless, Lee continued to fight because the sharps continued to appear. But all this allowed Kabelia to have a real feast of these demons. At that moment, someone called out to Lee, and he replied that he would not harm the magicians. But it was the guy who had tried to dissuade Lee from destroying Sumi's student, and he just wanted to talk. He said his name was Gu Wang, and that he and his friends were amazed by our hero's technique. Wang said he was deeply moved by Lee's skills and how he protected his man. For a few more minutes, they praised our hero non-stop, and then Wang asked Lee to hire them because they were mercenaries without a sect and good fighters. They honestly wanted to work for Lee, and our hero was surprised that they were more moved by the fact that he protected his man. Lee thought about how he probably looked really cool at that moment, and although he didn't want to have a lot of people around him, he realized that he could die, as happened that time with Kabelia, so he decided to hire them to watch over Kim so that he wouldn't get into a dangerous situation. He also noted that they shouldn't worry about payment, and that he would pay them for this work. After that, our hero noticed Wang's strange look and turned around to see an angry Pak. Lee sensed a heavy atmosphere coming from him and assumed that he was angry with him for taking the lead without permission. But Pak handed Lee a sword and smiled, saying that this sword belonged to an enemy of the Hua sect, and he hoped that Lee would accept it as a token of gratitude. Lee himself was shocked that his assumption about Pak's bad mood was wrong. It was the sword of the plum spirit, the greatest weapon of the madman of the blossoming plum. In the hands of a villain or a madman, the sword became stronger. Lee suggested aloud that Park wanted to appease him, and Park did not deny it, because it was the best sword the Three Heavens sect could offer. Our hero realized that he had been tense for no reason, judging only by Park's expression, but he was too quick-witted and needed to be cautious. And even though Li Huan had never taken bribes in the past, before his regression, but now Lee decided not to refuse the gift and accepted it, because the treasure collection could not replenish itself. But Lee noted that he had many new allies and felt awkward that he was the only one who received a gift. Pak replied that he would take care of it, and Lee noted that he was incredibly generous. Finally, it was time to rest, and Pak said that everyone could rest except those who were on guard duty. Pak said that after seeing the battle, Lee understood why Sumi had taken notice of him. Nevertheless, our hero was concerned about whether everything would be okay with the Alpha team. Pak noted that their captain was Sumi herself, the Archmage's apprentice, and she was not easy to defeat. Lee asked if Sumi was really that strong, and Pak replied that she was incredibly so. He immediately mentioned that Lee himself was also incredibly strong, which became clear after they shook hands. And while Pak was praising our hero, Lee thought that something was wrong. After all, despite the fact that Lee Sumi was so strong, he had no memories of her. According to Lee's calculations, since she was so talented, she should have created a tower for magicians in this region. Then the author appeared and said that Lee was probably wondering why he had no memories of Sumi, and Lee agreed. The author said that the answer to this question was actually quite simple. Our hero knew nothing about her, because this was the place where she would meet her end. Lee cried out when he learned this, and the author noted that it was exciting. After all, she and all the mercenaries and cult members would be wiped off the face of the earth, and Wanmen Elementary School would become a parallel world that could not be cleansed. The author thought this was great, and that such a situation would be an unexpected plot twist. He sincerely thought it would be fun and interesting, while Lee thought the author was a psychopath. When he said this, the author took offense and asked why he thought so. Lee spread his arms, pointing at the people, and asked if the author wanted to destroy them all for fun. The author replied that people would stop reading the novel if it wasn't interesting, and didn't understand why Lee disagreed. Our hero thought about why he didn't like what he was saying. Then he said that the plot development would be very strange if a powerful mage had to die. Lee was interested in what would happen to him in that case, and the author did not understand what he meant. Lee shouted that if everyone was going to die, then he should too. Lee noted that their original goal was to recruit a mad demon, and he told the author not to adjust the difficulty. The author replied that he didn't understand why Lee was angry, because someone had written a comment saying that if everything was easy, it would become uninteresting. Lee was furious that the author had decided to do this because of a single comment, and the author said that failure was not death. As the main character, he had to overcome difficulties and do everything possible to survive. Lee shouted that he didn't want to use him right away. After all, readers might not like that either. Nevertheless, the author was tired of these cries. He reminded Lee that he was the main character, and that he had the courage and strength to overcome all this, and that he would cope with everything. Finally, the author reminded him that he sincerely believed in his main character. After that, time was restored, and the author disappeared. Lee realized that he was unpredictable and did not expect everything to turn out so badly. Lee assumed that the author could no longer control himself, because the more he tried to create an interesting story, the stronger and more dangerous the enemies surrounding the main character became. And soon the moment would come when the main character would reach his limit and be unable to cope. Soon, the moment would come when the main character would reach a limit he could not overcome. And then his story would end with him being sent to the other world. However, since the level of difficulty had been increased, Lee understood that he needed to escape from there as soon as possible. Nevertheless, at that moment, most people believed that they would successfully complete their mission, and if he suggested that they simply retreat, they would be dissatisfied. At that moment, Lee saw a priest from the Church of Clotus standing nearby. He called him over and said that he would give him all his loot on one condition. Our hero wanted the priest from the church to predict the death of all the people who were now on the raid at the elementary school. At this time, Sumi continued to fight the Sharpmans with the help of an ice guillotine. After defeating them, Sumi said that she had expected it to be more difficult and thought that she was becoming paranoid. But suddenly she stared ahead and seemed to sense something. She abruptly moved on, and one of her teammates shouted that chairs had already been set up on the other side. But Sumi went there alone because she needed to check something herself. As she approached her target, Sumi realized she was right about the danger. Moreover, if what she saw turned out to be true, the raid on One-Man Elementary School would fail. At that moment, our hero laid out a pile of demon hearts in front of him and asked the priest to predict the death of people. The mercenaries were surprised that the priest had been there all this time, and it seemed to them that he was wasting the hearts. But our hero did not listen to them and asked the priest to start with Captain Sumi. The priest was surprised that he wanted to start with her, but quickly replied that she would die at school. The whole crowd was shocked by this statement about the death of the captain of Team Alpha. After that, in a trance-like state, the priest began to list a bunch of names, saying that they would all die. People began to fear because they had heard that the members of the Clotus Church were never wrong. Lee had been skeptical until that moment, but now he realized that Mr. Author was serious. This event gave Lee a compelling reason to get out of there. Although Lee told the people that death could not be predicted with 100% certainty, and that perhaps everything would be fine, he knew for sure that this place was so dangerous that they could all die there. The crowd began chanting and asking what they should do in this case, and how to avoid death. Lee suggested that everyone flee from this place to avoid being sent to the other world. Lee suggested that everyone flee this place to avoid being sent to the other world. The people realized that Lee was right, and that they needed to run away as quickly as possible and join the Alpha group as soon as possible. Pac turned to Lee and said that they urgently needed to find Sumi because they did not know which of the demons was the boss and could suffer losses. However, the exit from the room was blocked, and they couldn't escape. But Lee pointed out that since it was closed, they would have to open it, and from that moment on, there would be no breaks until the demons were completely destroyed. After that, he put a helmet on Kim's head, and the boy didn't understand what he was doing. Lee tightened the strap and said that he would not tell him to survive, because that would only bring death closer. But Lee asked him to just be careful, and then walked away from him. He noted that the boy should just try to avoid danger, while Lee was in the center of the battle. Lee suggested that Kim go with him, but the boy asked who told Lee that he would go too. Hearing this, Lee realized that it was pointless to persuade him, and went to the center of the battle without him. Kim used to believe that technology was superior to martial arts, and that magic was superior to technology. However, this opinion changed after his meeting with Li Huan, because he was shocked by how he dealt with enemies alone. The mad demon was shocked to the core, because Li could really deal with Diarch. After all, he was not just strong, but even stronger than Diarch with his skills. Seeing how Li fought, the boy shouted at him to destroy the prophecy of their doom, because then he would survive and be able to follow him. At the same time, Sumi discovered that she was right about her bad feelings. In one of the offices, she encountered a very powerful demon, Tromos, who grew stronger by absorbing fear. This discovery complicated everything, because Sumi couldn't deal with him alone. Tromos was a demon with an entire legion, and he was considered very powerful and grew stronger from human fear. And if his existence became known, he would become even stronger. Sumi didn't know if she should deal with him right now. Of course, she understood that she could defeat him now. After all, at that moment, he had not yet absorbed much fear from human emotions. While she was thinking about this, the door to the common corridor to Lee's room finally opened. Pak and everyone else were very happy that they could finally get out of there. As they ran out, Lee read the author's article about the events taking place and asked them not to pay attention to him. The author told him that he would increase the difficulty, but did not mention that he would create such a powerful boss, and Lee realized that Sumi could not fight him alone. On top of that, the demon was getting stronger by absorbing fear, and the beta team members were already overwhelmed with it because of the prediction of doom. Running out with everyone else, our hero realized he had to hurry. Lee ran, feeling a sense of foreboding, and hoped that Lee Sumi was alive. But at that moment, he met Sumi's commander on the stairs, and she said she had been looking for him. She said she had seen Tromos on the first floor and had come up here. Lee said that their demise had been predicted, so they decided to retreat as well. Sumi realized that she had had a bad feeling from the very beginning and couldn't believe that she would have to deal with Tromos. When the crowd heard Tromos' name, they were surprised to hear the name of the boss of the parallel world. Sumi realized that since his name was in the prophecy, it was good that she hadn't done anything stupid and attacked him alone. This demon seemed so powerful to her that he needed to be attacked on a national level, so she came here. She turned to Lee and asked him what he had done about the extermination, because they needed a plan. People headed out into the street and stood inside a large magic circle of invisibility, and everyone was already discouraged. But Park walked past them and said that they all needed to stick together and not scatter when the battle began. Sumi said that they had little time to prepare, but they had only one option to win. People around them asked what they should do, and mentioned that they didn't think it would work out. At that moment, the author himself was horrified by what he had written and thought he was doomed because Lee might not survive this battle. He began to panic that he shouldn't have increased the difficulty, but otherwise, it would have been boring, even though there was no choice. Lee understood that the author regretted his actions and therefore could be persuaded otherwise. He said that there was no need to overthink it and that if Tromos couldn't be weakened, Lee could be made stronger. But the author didn't understand how or why. At that moment, our hero looked at Sumi, and the author asked what was so special about her that he wanted to save her life. Lee said that he had figured out how to do it right, and that the author should trust him. Our hero approached Commander Sumi and asked if she had a plan of action. Sumi told Lee that none of them could defeat Tromos. Lee replied that he had a plan to emerge victorious from this situation. Our hero said that Sumi had come here to create a magic tower, which was true. Lee suggested that in that case, she had a magical item powerful enough to create the tower, and that item was the Bloodstone, which contained a large amount of mana for the foundation of the magic tower. Sumi asked if our hero wanted to use the Bloodstone in his plan. Lee asked her to give him the Bloodstone so that he could absorb the mana it contained and become stronger. The crowd began to shout that the stone was the result of decades of hard work by the tower, and that they could not give it to Lee. Lee replied that the only other option was to die, as there was no other way out. Sumi asked everyone to be quiet and pointed out that Li Huan only knew half the story. She was impressed that Lee knew about the Bloodstone, but had no idea what it was, since she herself couldn't absorb it. She took out a test tube and said that the Bloodstone wasn't like a stone. 20 such bubbles summoned the Bloodstone. Lee replied that anything was possible with his absorption method. He realized that the author supported his plan, and that if Sumi agreed, everything would be fine. However, if she refused, Lee would have to resort to brute force. The next moment, Sumi took out the bubbles and poured them onto the ground in front of her. The liquid that poured out of the bubbles began to transform into a bloodstone. Sumi said that if Lee could absorb the energy from it, they could defeat Tromos, and it didn't matter what happened to the tower. She mentioned that if there was a way to survive, it was worth trying. The only thing Sumi clarified was that Lee understood they had little time left. Tromos was a demon who grew stronger from Rhinestone, and they were in a school where there were many ghost stories. At midnight, something terrible was bound to happen here. Lee asked Sumi not to worry, because the absorption would not take him long. The author noted that the stone contained a huge amount of mana, and Lee might not be able to handle it quickly. Even our hero himself did not understand what would happen next and what would come of it. Since this was an unexpected plot twist, it was clear that it would not be easy. But Lee remembered that the author had told him that the role of the main character was to overcome difficulties. Then, Lee began to absorb the energy of the Bloodstone, which became a spectacular show for everyone around. People were worried that they would lose both Lee and the stone and be left without hope. But Sumi asked them to wait a little longer. She thought from the beginning that what Lee was proposing was impossible, but Sumi tried to believe in him. Her intuition told her that there was something special about our hero. The author was hysterical and yelled at Lee to stop, or he would die. He said that the human body couldn't withstand so much mana. Lee continued to absorb energy, even though he understood that the author was right. After all, the absorption technique had one important condition. In terms of internal strength, Lee had to have an advantage over his target. However, in the situation with the Bloodstone, everything was the opposite. There was so much mana in it that it surpassed even the first heavenly decree of the primordial fire. In this situation, Lee's power was hopelessly small, but an idea came to his mind. To implement it, he needed the help of little Kim, whom he called over to him. While Kim was running up to our hero, Lee thought that his intuition was telling him that everything would work out. When Kim was close, Lee used the great technique of 12 pressure points, which increased mana to its peak. After that, Lee put his hand on the boy's chest and asked him not to worry. Everyone around them watched them and didn't understand if what was happening was normal. The boy himself screamed from such a flow of energy and also didn't understand what was happening, but Lee shouted that he would help. Lee said that Kim would be able to do it because his potential was great, and he could achieve a state of perfect concentration just by looking at Lee. And our hero's plan was quite simple. He directed a huge amount of mana from the stone through himself into the mad demon. Then he transformed the infused mana in the boy's lower abdomen into inner strength. And only after that would he take this power for himself. Lee would not be able to take all the power. Part of it would remain in Kim's stomach and become his own, but that would be enough. All that was needed was for the boy to withstand this energy, and Lee shouted at him that he had to cope. A little later, Lee realized that his plan was working, and the mana began to stabilize, and they were almost at their goal. Kim was doing great, and he needed to focus harder, and then he could gain strength. The crowd was also shocked that Lee was succeeding, and the mana had stabilized. Sumi was delighted that Lee Huan had succeeded, and that he had really been able to do it. After that, Sumi asked the people what time it was, and they replied that it was 10 minutes to midnight. Sumi exhaled, because they had plenty of time until midnight, but they couldn't relax. However, the moment she said that, a gong sounded in the schoolyard. It was the sound of an old clock striking midnight, but it was much earlier than that. Looking closely at the school, people saw Tromos standing next to the old clock. This demon stood in front of the clock and turned the hands to midnight. People began to despair and decided that now they were doomed to failure. At that moment, the statues standing in front of the school entrance began to grow and move. But Sumi asked people to calm down because they were inside a protective magic circle, and there was no need to panic. At that moment, the statue with the book shouted a large-scale silence. This was a status that prohibited the use of mana and magic for a certain period of time. The statue shouted that people were disturbing her reading. She was the commander of the Tromos Legion and used the book for magical attacks. At that moment, the stone man rose from his seat and shouted that he was in agony. He summoned demons from the gates of hell. Sumi shouted to everyone that they could not use magic or mana, so she shouted for people to prepare demonic bullets against them. The battle was about to begin, and Sumi was only concerned about how much time Lee and Kim would need. She was only glad that the main boss, Tromos, had not yet begun to attack them. Sumi shouted that they had to buy time until the rising star finished absorbing the power. She ordered the people with demonic bullets and weapons to take up defensive positions around Lee, and then she shouted loudly for everyone to hear, "Fire on command!" Immediately, they used grenades and bombs against the statue, damaging it. But she seemed indifferent to this and used her book to attack. The pensive stone man said that the gates for the martyrs were open. After these words, the real gates of hell opened in the square, and demons poured out of them. Looking around, the raid participants realized that hell had descended upon them. Lee was angry at the author for raising the difficulty levels so sharply. It took him much longer to absorb energy than he had originally expected. And even though he had used 240 years of inner strength, he could not lose his vigilance, and if he got distracted, he would be in danger. He closed his eyes and thought that he was almost at his goal and needed to be patient a little longer. And when he closed his eyes, one of the sharpmen attacked him from the right. But the demon was not destined to attack Lee, and he was hit by Wang's demonic bullets. Another demon was easily cut into pieces by Commander Pak's sword. Meanwhile, the number of demons was growing by the second, and then Pak thought that this was the most difficult moment in his life. He felt that his strength was at its limit. Pak had been raiding for 24 years, but now the commander felt as if this would be his last sword. Nevertheless, he was very happy to finally become the leader of the team. Looking at the giant stone man, he said that he never thought he would go to the other world so soon. The statue swung its huge fist at him and Wang, and Pak thought that he should be happy to be the leader of the team. While he was thinking about his imminent death, the silhouette of our hero flashed before him. With the help of the sixth form of the heavenly demon's sword, Lee summoned lightning and struck the giant's arm with his sword. This blow destroyed half of the living statue. It then fell to the ground, and our hero emerged from the dust, looking like a superhero. The people saw their hope in Lee, and chanted loudly that the rising star had returned. Lee himself apologized for making people wait so long. At that moment, a bunch of demons wanted to attack him from behind, but Sumi froze them all with her ice guillotine. Breaking the ice into pieces, she congratulated Li Huan on becoming stronger. She noted that fate can be unpredictable. Fortunately for her, the silence was over, although it would have been better if Li had intervened a little earlier and not kept the lady waiting. Li joked that he couldn't see the lady, and Sumi replied that if he could joke, it meant he was in good shape. In any case, Lee noted that Sumi had done well, and that he would now join them. Besides, there was no way out of this parallel world yet. Our hero also turned to Wang and Pak, and thanked them for protecting him. Lee also asked them to make sure that Kim, who had lost consciousness, was okay. Looking at Lee, Pak realized that his inner strength had greatly increased, and now they really had a chance to win. Lee looked at the statues and said he didn't have time to relax, and Sumi pointed out that they weren't his target. She called him to follow her, and showed him where our hero's target was. Looking at it, Lee realized that this powerful demon was finally in front of him. His opponent was Tromos, who was already waiting for Lee on the roof of the school. Lee looked at Tromos, and the demon in his case looked straight at our hero in response. A few moments later, our hero had already jumped onto the roof of the building where the demon was waiting for him. And while Tromos was stretching energetically, Lee watched and decided that he looked like a little child. Looking at Lee, Tromos was surprised that he was an old geezer to him. Despite his words, Lee felt how strong the demon standing before him was, despite his young age. Our hero understood that he was not weak either. He had overworked himself by absorbing 120 years of power, so he could not use the pressure technique. But he had 240 years of inner strength, and was at the level of a transcendent master. In addition, Sumi had given him some kind of potion before he came to Tromos, and Lee knew that he could definitely handle him. Tromos himself shouted to Lee that he was offering to fight him fairly. By this, he meant that he could defeat his opponents with a single blow, and his nickname was One Punch Demon, and he would defeat anyone with a single blow. It was strange for Lee that a demon used such slang words, and he was probably influenced by elementary school students. But it didn't matter to Lee, because he himself had once been the king of fistfights, and asked Tromos not to cry about it. Tromos replied that Lee was too brave, and that he should be given credit for that, then swung for a blow. But our hero managed to dodge the demon's powerful blow, and Lee realized that he was really strong. In addition to his incredible strength, Tromos also possessed incredible speed. When their fight began on the roof of the school, it was as if an explosion had occurred, and dust rose into the air. The speed of Lee and Tromos's blows was incredibly high, and each of them dodged the blows. However, Lee was generally better at dodging than Tromos, and our hero even managed to hit him hard several times. Lee realized that he hadn't fought a good opponent with his fists in a long time, and this made him remember the days of his past. These were his memories of the days when he was called the King of Fists. Back then, he lived only for justice, but he was still betrayed by those close to him. And now he understood that he had to take revenge for this, for himself and his comrades who had been mercilessly destroyed in the past. And to achieve his goal of revenge, Lee had to defeat Tromos. So our hero summoned the dragon-slaying fist, and thought that he needed to get out of there alive. Seeing Lee's fist, Tromos shouted that our hero was cowardly hiding a trick up his sleeve, and added that he also had skills. Then Tromos's Van Punch attack, and our hero's attack, combined into one blow. There was a powerful explosion, and Tromos saw that his hand could not withstand the blow, and broke. Tromos called Lee a cheater, but he replied that he fought fairly with his fists, just as Tromos wanted. Tromos yelled that he hadn't said that, and our hero began to annoy him incredibly. He started screaming loudly, and said that his friends would pay for his actions. At that moment, Pak yelled at his guys to hold on a little longer because the exit was about to open. But at that moment, he was attacked by the leader of the Sharpmans with a demonic core. Because of Tromos's screams, all the demons, including this one, began to increase in size and power. Pak didn't even have time to think about anything as sharp as razors. Sickles cut through his body, and life left him. Lee saw from the roof that the demons had suddenly become stronger and more powerful. At that moment, our hero realized that this was a special skill of this demon, and that at this rate, they could lose everyone. At that moment, Tromos quickly crept up behind our hero and asked if he was scared. When Lee turned around, Tromos pierced him through with a blow from his hand. Lee felt a burning pain in his stomach, and Tromos shouted that it was a good blow. Tromos's voice seemed to be moving away from our hero, and he realized that his death was approaching. But Lee had a special watch on his wrist, and after a few moments, it lit up. This meant that Lee had come back to life, and at that moment, he croaked that it was a waste of life. After all, using the liquor of life and death here was a waste, he said as he got to his feet. After that, Lee broke the bottle that Lee Sumi had given him and completely healed our hero. When he got to his feet, he said that now he understood why Lee Sumi was so famous. He felt completely healed and realized that her reagents were very effective. At that moment, Tromos shouted that Lee was a monster, and he replied that he would not like a monster to call him a monster. Lee thought that he had almost gone to the other world, but the clock helped him come to his senses, and if he kept his composure, he would surely win. Tromos shouted that it was simply impossible and wrong for Lee to be alive. Lee realized that he must not be distracted by what was happening below, and that after defeating Tromos, the exit would open. So our hero gathered all his strength in his fist and shouted at the demon to die quickly. But Tromos asked him to wait, and at that moment disappeared underground. Our hero realized that the demon had escaped, but he didn't have time to look for it. Kabalia said that Lee shouldn't worry, because the exit from the parallel world had just opened. Lee was delighted, and thought that they had fulfilled some conditions for this, and could finally leave this hell. After all they had to do was escape from the parallel world, and Lee looked at the battlefield. At that moment, in reality, the guard asked how much time they had left, and it turned out to be 15 minutes. They also wondered if the raid in the parallel world was going well, and thought that it was because of Lee and Sumi. The only thing that worried them was the closing procedure. And at that moment, one guard noticed that people were starting to come out of the portal. The guard was upset that the raid always ended during his shift, but what the guards saw made them freeze in surprise. They didn't understand what had happened, since so few of the 500 people had come out. And in our hero's heart, there was unconditional, deepest sorrow. He couldn't describe it any other way, because initially, 531 people had gone to the parallel world. But to his great regret, only 8 had come out, and the guards immediately ran to contact headquarters. Our hero began to remember the people he had met, and they had all died. A girl from the Clotis church was standing at the exit and mentioned that Lee had returned from the other world. She asked him to tell her the names of his comrades so that she could remember them. The author was pleased that she had finally appeared, as he had added this character a long time ago. But Lee didn't care about her and silently walked past her and the author, who began to worry that they had come up with a good story. But Lee was not satisfied. In the end, our hero brought Kim to his apartment and told him to go through the portal first. Lee looked at the boy and asked him not to worry and to go inside first. When Kim entered the room, Lee slammed the door behind him and said that he had made up his mind. Then he took his sword in his hands, threw it on the floor, and said that he would just forget everything and give up. And then the author quickly ended the chapter. He suddenly appeared and asked what was going on with Lee Huan. Lee replied that he had decided to leave because his story was terrible, and Lee didn't understand why. The author said that Lee was wrong, and that his story was really interesting, but Lee didn't understand why. God said that anyone could be asked, and they would all confirm it. Dai was just too immersed in his character. He needed difficulties in order to develop, but Lee believed that the senseless efforts of his enemies were not difficulty, nor was the death of everyone. The author noted that Sumi and the demon survived. Lee absorbed the bloody stone and got the sword, and all of this was interesting. Lee replied that he made it all up when he was sorting out the mess left by the author. The author was deeply offended that Lee called his story a mess and started yelling. Lee shouted back that he had considered the story an uninteresting mess from the very beginning. After that, Lee calmly said that he wanted to stop right now and asked the author to return him to reality. The author couldn't believe that Lee Huan was completely serious. After that, he asked if our hero was sure he wouldn't regret it. Lee replied that the author should have asked that before ruining everything. The author got angry and shouted that Lee wasn't the only one who could be the main character of his story. After that, our hero simply vanished in the hallway because of the author's actions. After kicking Lee out of the novel, the author wrote and was angry at our hero, calling him ungrateful and saying that the novel would continue without him. He had already finished writing the 4th chapter without Li Huan and was going to continue. The author wanted Li to regret that his novel existed perfectly well without Li. At first, people were happy about the quick release of new chapters, and the author also responded happily to them. But then people started writing that they were becoming disappointed in the novel, even though they thought it was good. The novel's ranking began to plummet, and people wrote that it used to be better and that they were giving up on reading it. Some even wrote that the author had mental health issues and that it was surprising that he had gotten this far. Li Huan had already seen these comments in the real world and said that he had warned the author that this would happen. He understood that these comments had affected the author's mental health, as he had not posted anything for more than 3 days. Nevertheless, Li thought that it did not matter and that it would serve as an example for the author. But he still didn't understand how the author could just disappear and whether he missed his novel, the events he wrote about, and the characters in them. If Li had been the author, he would have tried to fix the situation somehow, or help the author deal with it. But hiding under the blanket, he realized that there was no point in that because it was all over. Li thought that he had been too harsh, and that even though he didn't like a lot of things, the author was a good person. Li thought that he could continue if he cheered him up a little. He was also curious about what had happened to the mad demon. After all, he had run away as soon as he met him, and now he must be in shock that Li had disappeared for so long. And the generals of the divine sun and moon must be puzzled as to why a boy came to them instead of Li. Li was also worried about Sumi, and wondered if she had returned to the Tower of 7 Stars. He remembered that he had failed to use the liquor of life and death, and had not even been able to defeat Tromos. Then Li thought he should ask the author to join forces again, but then he threw his phone on the bed, realizing that he couldn't contact the author and that he'd better go to sleep. However, at that moment, a message came to our hero's phone. Li unlocked his phone and saw a message from Mr. Author, asking if our hero was already asleep. Our hero couldn't believe that it was really the author, and even thought it was fake. But looking at his annoying avatar, Li realized that it was really him, and yet he was happy that the author had written to him, because they had quarreled before. At first, Li decided to act as if he didn't know who the author was. Soon he replied, and asked if they could chat, and Li said that the author could write whatever he wanted. The author wrote that he admitted Li was right, and that they had different perspectives on the situation, but he needed advice. God asked if they could start over from the beginning with Li. Li was annoyed by the author's banality. He was about to ignore him, but then he realized that this was his chance to make a comeback. The author wrote that readers were waiting for the novel, and they needed to work together, but Li wanted an apology, and the author gave it to him. Li didn't expect the author to be so accommodating, but he realized he needed to be firm. He wrote to the author that he had a condition, and the author immediately asked what it was. Li asked for editing rights, and he would continue without hesitation. The author asked Li not to cross the line, and Li gave him an ultimatum that otherwise they would not be able to work together. After all, people don't change with words alone, and editing rights are a completely different story, in Li's opinion. If Li could edit some of the boring parts of the novel, or make sure that the events of One Men's School don't happen again, it would be a serious conversation. But the main question was whether the author would agree to it or not. More than 5 minutes had passed since Li sent the message, but the author still hadn't replied. Li began to worry, and thought that he had gone too far, and should have negotiated differently. But at that moment, the author wrote that he would grant this right, but only once. Our hero was very happy about this message, and couldn't believe that it had worked. Li decided to hurry before the author changed his mind, and started typing a message to him, offering to sign a contract. The author did not understand why this was necessary, but thought that they needed to meet first, and a flash caused Li to disappear. He then materialized in the same place where he had disappeared a few days earlier. Trying to move every part of his body, he realized that he had indeed returned. At that moment, the author tapped him on the back with his finger and asked him to turn around. The author looked a little confused and handed our hero a silver ring. It was a promise ring with the divine power of its creator. It could turn back time, but only once. The ring allowed him to return to the past without losing his power, and this item was simply crazy. Li couldn't believe that the author was willingly giving him the ring, but then the author hesitated for a second. He asked Li how he was going to fix everything, and if he had a plan. After all, the novel ended with Li Huan saying he was giving up and disappearing. Li smiled, took the ring, and replied that of course he had a plan. Lee had an amazing plan, and he asked the author not to worry about it. The novel continued with Li Huan returning a week after his absence. It was a little strange that his hair had grown noticeably longer, as if he had been away for more than a week. It seemed like at least 6 months had passed, but there was a reason for that. The level of difficulty at Wonmin's school was different from what he remembered from his past life, and Lee suspected that the god who had sent him back to the past had interfered unreasonably, and therefore could not contain his anger. And even though Lee had no idea which god had done this to him, or why he had sent him back to the past, but one thing was clear to him: he needed to find a way to protect himself from this god. And so our hero decided to go to the Abyss, which was a huge parallel world where few people had been. It was there that he found an amazing ring, and when he returned, he was shocked to discover that 6 months in the Abyss was 10 days in the normal world. Even Kabalia herself was shocked that Lee had managed to find the ring of the one and only god who created the world. The author was shocked that Leah knew him, which set her apart from many other characters. Lee replied that she was a special demon, and that this should not be forgotten. And now Lee told Leah to find out the plans of the god who sent him into the past. He noted that in any case, she had done a good job, and it was worth it that she had devoured many demons. Now Leah looked much older, because she had grown up quite a bit in the Abyss. Lee thought that the author must now be pleased with the plot, because they were on good terms again, and opened the door to the apartment. Upon entering, Lee wondered how everyone was doing, and hoped that they hadn't been sad without him. There, he saw that Vol was teaching little Kim how to hold a sword in a stance. At that moment, our hero felt unbearably awkward being in the room and saying that he had returned. Kim was distracted by him, and Vol hit him on the head, telling him not to get distracted during training. Looking at the little boy, Lee realized that Kim had trained a lot, and his stance had improved significantly. Lee realized that the generals had taken care of his training while he was away, and now they could be proud of him. Lee's swords were also completely intact and safe. Nevertheless, Lee felt a tense atmosphere, because the generals were upset that Lee had disappeared for a week without saying anything. So he decided he needed to cheer them up and order beer and chicken. Il immediately rushed to the food and drink, and said that there was nothing better than this. She commented that when you bite into a piece of crispy golden crust, your mouth is filled with a spicy taste and aroma. And when you wash it all down with beer, an indescribable, refreshing sensation appears in your throat. Il told Vol to try it too, because Lee had a good reason to be absent. Besides, Lee understood that Kim wouldn't be able to eat while Vol was upset. After that, chewing on the second leg, Il said that it was obvious that Lee had been through a lot. Il also said that they were very bored when Lee was gone for a long time. That was why they decided to train Kim, because he had great potential. Lee knew this, and said that he was called a mad demon. Il was surprised by the information about the mad demon, because to become one, you had to kill a huge number of people. She was amazed that little Kim was so strong, and Lee noted that because he was with him, his potential was growing every day. Lee thought that he would be sad if he died, because he had gone through the Wanmen school to get him, and needed to make him strong enough. Il wondered if Kim could match the strength of the Holy Spirit demon. Then the author intervened in the conversation, and said that this was the most powerful of the mad demons. Just as there are 9 great ones in Orthodox sects, there were 10 demonic sects, and this demon was born in the Sword Mountain sect. He achieved great success in the technique of the Holy Spirit, but was terribly arrogant and powerful. Then Lee asked why they didn't teach Kim the technique of the Holy Spirit, and Il replied that only the Sword Mountain sect could do that. Lee replied that they would succeed because everything was much easier. At that moment, he thought about how he was the main character. He told Il that the real name of the Holy Spirit technique was the Asura technique. She was very surprised by this. Il couldn't believe that Lee was talking about the technique used by the Asura squad from the Heavenly Demon sect. Lee said that this was true, and that he knew it very well. It was a unique Asura technique that had elevated the heavenly demons, and Lee wanted to pass it on to Kim. Il then realized that the Sword Mountain sect had its roots in the Heavenly Demon sect. Lee replied that this was indeed the case, and that the Sword Mountain sect from the Central Plains should be at his feet. Our hero realized that the next chapter would be devoted to the revival of the Heavenly Demon sect, and he would begin with the capture of the Sword Mountain sect. The author was very pleased that Lee had come up with such an interesting story, and began to prepare for it. At the same time, the Sword Mountain faction, which had arisen due to the use of the Asura technique, was improved. The revival of the Heavenly Demon sect was added to the plot of the novel. It was added to the story that the main branch of the Sword Mountain sect were the Asuras, who swore allegiance to the descendants of the Heavenly Demons. After reading this, Lee praised the master, and said that this was exactly what he had imagined. The author was glad to hear this, and then Lee asked who the girl in the pictures was, because she looked beautiful from behind. The author replied that it was a secret, and that Lee would have to find out for himself, and Lee waited impatiently for this. They shook hands and agreed that they would try to work together without quarreling. After a while, Lee turned on the printer, and Il asked what it was, and Lee began to explain how it worked. Il was very surprised by such a device, and confirmed that times had changed greatly. Lee explained that books were now stored digitally, and in his hands was a book about Asur technology. It was a weakened version of the divine martial art of the heavenly demons for the Asura squad, and by mastering it, a person could achieve enlightenment. Upon reaching enlightenment, a person would be strongly connected to the first heavenly decree of the primordial fire. After reading this, Lee realized that it would only help him and make it easier to capture Sword Mountain. At that moment, Il approached him and asked Lee to let her read the book, but it was unclear why, since she had already reached the highest point. She replied that she had argued with the general of the Divine Moon about who would make Kim stronger. With the Asur technique, she expected to win this argument. Lee didn't mind letting her see it, and gave her the book, for which she was grateful. Then, for a while, our hero was browsing the news on his computer, and came across a story about the raid on the one-man school. He knew he couldn't pretend nothing had happened, but the past couldn't be changed, and he needed to be more level-headed. Still, Lee's desire to take revenge and send Tromos to the other world had not disappeared. Just as he was thinking about this, Il returned the book on Asur techniques to him. Lee was surprised that she had finished reading it so quickly, and Il reminded him who she was. She had mastered all the techniques in just half a day. Lee saw that her eyes were glowing green, which meant that she had reached the state of Asur enlightenment. Our hero shouted at her that she was supposed to read it, not master it, and Il thought that Lee was too greedy. But in fact, the reason for Lee's reaction was not that at all. Il got angry and asked our hero not to lie to her and not to be angry with her. She added that if Lee was so upset, he shouldn't have given her the book. Lee didn't answer her and ordered her to sit down, which she did immediately. Il was terrified because she didn't understand what was happening to her body. Lee didn't answer her and ordered her to start picking her nose with her finger. But our hero still didn't answer and ordered her to put her finger in her mouth. And before she had practically done so, Lee said she could stop. Il awkwardly thanked our hero for this, and asked again what was happening to her. Lee replied that there was a restriction on those who had mastered the Asur technique, and she had no choice but to obey the first heavenly decree. Il didn't understand how this was even possible. Lee replied that this restriction was created by the great demons, and he didn't know how to remove it. Then Il said that this was nonsense, and that if she released the inner power of her body and completely get rid of the energy she had gained from the Asur technique, she would be able to cope. But at that moment, Lee ordered her to eat her goat, and Il realized that nothing was working. She looked at the floor in disappointment and asked if there was really nothing she could do about it. At that moment, there was a frenzied laugh from Vol, who was laughing at his sister. He called her a fool because she had willingly become Lee's slave. Then Il flew at him with her fists and shouted that Vol was a traitor and that he should have supported her instead of mocking her. Watching this spectacle, Lee realized that he would not be able to stop them. At that moment, Kim quietly approached him and said that he had been waiting a long time for his master. Lee smiled and asked how Kim was doing, as he was eagerly waiting to finally work with him. At that time, Sumi arrived at Wanmen Elementary School for some reason. The man standing at the gate told her that she was a little late. She replied that she didn't think the parallel world declared a disaster would be dealt with so quickly, and so she was incredibly curious to know who could have destroyed Tromos himself. After a while, our hero learned that Tromos had been sent to the other world and was furious about it. Lee immediately began to pressure the author that he should have done it, but the author said that the characters did it without his participation. Lee thought it was all ridiculous and couldn't believe that he wouldn't be able to take revenge. He thought that in that case, he should go straight to the Mountain of Swords. But remembering the people from this raid, Lee realized that he couldn't do that and had to finish the job. So he opened the door to the apartment and warned Il and Wan that he would be gone for a short time and that they needed to look after Kim. He also added that he was going to Wanmen Elementary School, and Kim wanted to go with him, but Wol didn't allow it. Wol also asked if our hero was leaving again for a long time or not, but our hero promised to return quickly and asked them to take care of Kim in the meantime. The author did not understand why Lee would return to the place where Tremosa was killed. However, our hero said that he had to get the reward for him anyway. The author noted that Lee didn't even know what the reward for Tromos was, but Lee said he could make it into what he needed. So Lee hinted that he had the ability to edit the the world, and had already given the author hints. When our hero arrived at the square in front of the school, the crowd was surprised to see him there, but they didn't understand why he had returned. Lee himself asked people questions and learned something about the victor over Tromos. It turned out that it was not a demon or a powerful creature, but just a person, and he had to decide how to get the reward from him. Lee thought that he could arrange a duel in which the winner would take everything, but that would waste pages of the novel. Then Lee thought he could make a deal in which he could offer a gold ring. Lee named this man the Dark Lord, and now he finally had a name and a story. He was the second most powerful assassin after the King of Executioners, and dreamed of surpassing him. As soon as Lee decided that this man would be the Dark Lord, a frightening aura began to emanate from him, and it was necessary to negotiate with him. At that moment, the crowd was shocked that Lee himself was the first to speak to the Dark Lord. They decided that Lee was going to take revenge for the Dark Lord's destruction of Tromos. But Lee thought it would be a shame to disappoint them, that there would be no battle, because the Dark Lord had what Lee needed. So our hero asked him a simple question. Could they just talk? Our hero asked if the Dark Lord wanted to surpass the King of Executioners. He showed him a gold ring that hides all the wearer's scents. It was clear that the ring interested the Dark Lord, because he knew how important it was for an assassin to get rid of smells. Immediately, Lee felt the Dark Lord's thirst for blood begin to emanate from him. But it and his stubbornness were directed not at our hero, but at someone else. Lee could already see how the Dark Lord imagined sending the King of Executioners to the other world. Our hero really hoped that he would agree, and that their exchange would take place. Suddenly, the Dark Lord asked Li Huan to name the person he wanted to send to the other world. Then, the Dark Lord would be able to help our hero with this ring. For Li, it was terribly unclear what his opponent was talking about. Li replied that the Dark Lord had misunderstood him, and that he did not want to send anyone to the other world, and instead wanted a reward for Tromos. The Dark Lord strangely asked in response what Li wanted in exchange for the ring. He asked Lee to reveal his intentions about what he wanted to receive. Lee realized that the Dark Lord had a strange way of communicating, and he needed to understand whether the exchange would take place. But then the author intervened and said that his appearance and manner of communication were different, and that it was interesting. And even though he looked strange, he agreed. The author explained that he was simply asking what Lee wanted to exchange the ring for. Lee held out the ring and said he wanted to exchange it for the reward the Dark Lord had received from Tromos. He assumed that the reward was worth less than the gold ring, and that the Dark Lord must have known this. According to Lee, if he were in the Dark Lord's place, he would have spent all his wealth. Lee also added that the Dark Lord would not have another chance to get this ring, and that if he were in his place, he would have agreed to the exchange. And in the next moment, their exchange took place after all, because the Dark Lord agreed to everything. Lee breathed a sigh of relief, because he didn't want to fight him, and was glad that their exchange had been successful. Our hero was confident that he had received a good item in exchange for the gold ring. It was the leader's glove, which gives strength and calms subordinates. It heals minor injuries and enhances skills. In addition, it increased the potential and strength of subordinates, which was exactly what Lee wanted. With this, he would be able to achieve excellent synergy in the revival of the Heavenly Demon sect and allow Kim to develop better. In addition, Lee would be able to prevent future disasters, like the one at Wanmen Elementary School. After some time in the hideout, the generals began fighting again, and Il began to defeat her brother. He, in turn, did not understand how she managed to do it, because this had never happened before. Il herself was in shock, because she had never been able to defeat her brother before, and had not felt such strength in a long time. She decided that her training had finally paid off, and made her stronger. But in reality, this was not the case, as it was the effect of the leader's glove that Lee had put on. Lee himself was very happy that everything had ended smoothly, and although he was unable to destroy Tromos, he received a reward for him. Lee assumed that the Dark Lord would now seek to destroy the King of Executioners on behalf of our hero. But Lee himself was already flying to the Central Plains at that time. Kim flew with Lee and asked him if they should capture Sword Mountain. The author said that Kim was right and that they should do it. But when he turned to Lee, he realized that Lee wasn't listening to him. The boy was interested in whether he needed to prepare for this, and Lee said no. But then our hero realized that the boy needed to learn about the history of the sects. So he gave him a phone with a video about the history of those places and sects, and told him to watch it. Lee himself was thinking about the incident at Wanmen School and its consequences. After the deal with the Dark Lord, Lee thought that Sumi would complain about the Bloodstone, but she was calm. In addition, she asked our hero to join her guild, and Lee had to refuse. Kang Il-chan was also there, who clearly distinguished between public and private matters, and he apologized on behalf of the Bureau for the incident. But Lee knew that it was not their mistake, and that the author had suddenly changed the level of difficulty. And even though everything ended well there, a small problem arose at home. When Lee returned home, he saw Il simply beating his brother. The latter couldn't believe it and called what was happening complete nonsense, because it was impossible to suddenly exceed one's limits. Il insisted that she was talking about how important dedication to training was, and as the Sun General, she made the impossible possible. While Lee was watching all this, Kim approached him and greeted his master. Our hero asked how he was doing and inquired about what was happening with the generals. Kim explained that initially they were equal and their battles ended in a draw, but suddenly Il became stronger, and she claimed that she had surpassed her limits thanks to her perseverance. However, the Moon General refused to acknowledge this, and their battle had been going on for some time. And even though Kim didn't know all the details, he acknowledged the fact that Il had become stronger. After that, Lee explained to the generals why Il had become stronger, and Wool couldn't help but laugh. He pointed at his sister and shouted that he knew it would happen, and that she had become stronger by being Lee's slave. Wool understood that it was quite logical that a slave should receive benefits thanks to his master. Il asked Lee if that meant that the glove he wore on his hand increased the potential of his subordinates. Since she had mastered the Asur technique and become attached to Lee, her abilities had increased, and Lee noted that this was true. Vol continued to laugh hysterically, reminding her that Il had said it was only thanks to her perseverance. In any case, Il felt that she had surpassed her limits, and thanks to this, she was now stronger than General Moon, and no one could deny it. She shouted that this was all that mattered, and that the fact was that she was now stronger than him, and would always be. After all, Vol would never agree to be associated with Li Huan, and now he had no choice but to accept that the Sun General was stronger than him. Then Vol shouted to Li Huan that he also wanted to master the Asura technique. Il couldn't believe that Vol wanted to defeat her so badly, and he replied that he wanted to master the technique of the great heavenly demon. While they were shouting at each other, Lee covered Kim's ears. In the end, both generals mastered this technique, and when Lee was about to leave, he told them something like an order to guard the refuge until Lee returned. And they simultaneously called our hero a master and agreed to do so. Now Lee could head to the Central Plains without worry and in comfort, but he was interrupted by the author, who was curious about Lee's new chapter. The author said that he was talking about the Mountain of Swords, which was equivalent to an entire country where he had created powerful masters. There were 8 mountain peaks called the 8 Peaks of the Mountain of Swords, and on each peak there was a master who had his own army. In addition, there was the Lord of the Mountain of Swords, who ruled all the peaks at once. This lord had an only daughter who was his heir. The author did not reveal anything else, and hoped that the details would remain a secret, but that Lee would definitely like them. In addition, the author hoped that Lee would not complain that everything was too complicated. Lee replied that he wouldn't, since Wanman Elementary School was difficult for no reason, and the Mountain of Swords arose naturally in the story. In addition, the Mountain of Swords was connected to the Asuras of the sect of heavenly demons, and that is why they must all be subordinates of our hero, and the stronger they are, the better for Lee. Lee also added that it would be unpleasant if they welcomed him too warmly. After some time, a subordinate arrived at the Master of Sword Mountain. He said that the Eastern Dragon Li Huan had recently arrived in their land. Then the Lord of Sword Mountain ordered all his subordinates to prepare. At this time, a dinner was held in a hotel in one of the districts of Sword Mountain in the Central Plains. 6 people who were happy to return home attended this dinner. The subordinates thanked the commander for his help, because their battle was difficult, and they would not have been able to cope without him. Guok, as commander, replied that it was all thanks to their cooperation, and not him, because such glorious victories were rare for them. But they were all happy that after 6 months, they had finally returned home. At that moment, Li Huan and Kim entered the hotel, and our hero noted that he was hungry. They sat down at a table with the boy, and Lee asked the waiter to come over to take their order. When the waiter approached, he said that if they felt uncomfortable, it would be better for them to leave. He pointed to Guok's group and said that they were from a special unit of the Mountain of Swords sect and had just returned from the front. Lee was surprised to meet the Sword Mountain squad so quickly, as he had not expected it. The waiter noted that it would be unpleasant if a confrontation occurred, and at that moment, Lee greeted them. He also asked if they could eat together, and Guok's team began to look aggressive. The only one who was happy was the author, who could not wait for this to happen. He dreamed that when the main character arrived at the hotel, an unexpected fight would begin. But to the author's incredible surprise, this did not happen, and they began to drink together at the table in a friendly manner. Guok's team was glad that Lee joined them, because everyone else was leaving for some reason. Guok asked where Lee came from, and he said that they were from Korea. Then our hero introduced himself as Li Huan, and the author was angry that he didn't start a fight. Lee replied that in the future, they would become his subordinates, and it was pointless to fight, and that pretending to be weak was fun. Guak also introduced himself and said that Lee had a glorious name, after which he asked which sect our hero belonged to. Lee replied that there was no need to be so formal with him, as he was fortunate enough to have inherited the technique of the 7 unchanging sword strikes. Guak was surprised that Lee had inherited a technique that was only passed on to one person in the sect, and called Lee incredible. The author watched this and thought it was a pity that there was no fight. But it wasn't bad, because the main thing was to get here. But in reality, he didn't think so, and his thoughts were filled with hope for a fight. At that moment, Guak asked why Lee's little friend was so quiet. Lee replied that he didn't know the local language, and Guak said that it would be difficult for him here, and then asked what brought them to Sword Mountain. Lee thought he wanted to capture it, but truthfully replied that he had business with the head. But at that moment, someone slammed the front door of the hotel very loudly. A guy grinned and said that he had finally found his older brother. He asked if it was necessary to make his younger brother look for him, since all he had to do was report his return immediately. Mayan was the greatest student of Sword Mountain and had achieved a high position on his own. He asked when Guak had returned, and Guak replied that they hadn't seen each other in a long time, and he was going to contact his brother. But Mayan wasn't interested, and repeated his question about when his older brother had returned. Guak replied that he had arrived the day before, and Lee realized that he was good, but not very competent. The younger brother, on the other hand, was skilled, but too arrogant. Lee thought that this was too cliched for the author, and at that moment, Main called Kim a rat of Diarca. He laughed at his older brother's acquaintance, calling him pathetic. Main added that Guak should at least protect his dignity and not associate with such people. And while he was laughing loudly, our hero shouted at him to shut up. Main's expression changed, and Lee said again that he thought someone had lost their dog. The author was delighted with what was happening because he was so hoping for a fight. In the next moment, Mayan said that he was the best student of the Mountain of Swords and the strongest among the 8 peaks. At the same time, Lee insulted him, and he became curious as to why he was so bold. After that, Mayan asked which sect our hero belonged to, and he replied that he had come from Korea. Rising from his chair, he looked at Main and said his name was Lee Hwan. Main's team did not expect to hear this name because their master had told them about him. Mayan understood that if this was Lee Hwan, they would not be able to quietly send him to the other world. Besides, he did not know if he could defeat him one-on-one or not. Mayan couldn't believe that his older brother knew about this and was just watching. But from the look on his face, he realized that this was impossible, because he wasn't that smart. Besides, he hadn't been here for 6 months and couldn't have known about the master's words or who Lee Hwan was. At that moment, Mayan shouted for his men to close the doors and be ready to call the military. Lee asked him if he wanted to fight, and Mayan replied that he knew Lee was an Eastern dragon, but in doing so, he insulted the greatest disciple of the Mountain of Swords on their territory. Lee replied that Mayan had insulted his disciple first and pointed to Kim. Mayan asked if he could prove that the boy was his disciple and not Diarca's rat. After all, if Lee was telling the truth, then Kim must possess martial arts skills and be able to prove it according to the laws of martial arts. Mayan thought that he didn't care whether the boy was Lee's disciple or not. He would play with him a little and then send him to the other world. After that, Lee Hwan would be furious at losing his student. As soon as he caused chaos in front of the military, they would arrest him and take him to Sword Mountain. In this way, Main would be able to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. He decided to teach the arrogant Lee a lesson and then hand him over to his master. Kim realized that the situation was not ideal, and Lee added that Main was looking down on them. Lee asked Kim what he was going to do, since Main had insulted his master. He replied that he would destroy him because he had to teach him a lesson. Lee realized that he was not called a mad demon for nothing, because his aura was powerful, and he asked Kim not to cause him too many problems. He also added that it would not be so easy to deal with him. No matter how many skills Kim had acquired, he was still young and had no real combat experience. On the other hand, Mayan was one of the most famous figures on Sword Mountain, and this battle promised to be difficult. One of Main's men told Kim to attack him first, giving him the advantage. Our hero noted that they wanted Kim to start, and he didn't understand why Main didn't come out against him. Lee replied that their leader did not want to deal with a child like Kim himself. Therefore, he advised him to create a situation that would force him to intervene. And while they were all engrossed in conversation, Kim knocked one of Main's men to the floor with an uppercut. Our hero was glad to see this, because he believed that this was how it should be. After all, the boy Kim was a disciple of the heavenly demon. After that, our hero asked Main if he needed any more proof. But at that moment, 3 other men attacked Kim at the same time. Guak was surprised that the 3 of them attacked a child together. He considered it unfair to attack a minor, but our hero thought it was unfair on their part. After all, thanks to the Bloodstone, He had the power of 120 years inside him, and he could already use half of it. In addition, he was trained by 2 great martial arts gods and mastered the Asura technique. His current level was beyond common sense, but he still had no experience in real battles. Therefore, Lee was surprised that his student was so good-looking. After little Kim defeated Mino's comrades, he pointed his sword at him and said he was next. Mayan himself was enraged by such arrogance directed at him. As a result, he drew his sword and shouted at Kim that he could consider himself dead. In response, little Kim shouted that he would tear Mayan to pieces. Gavk watched this and did not understand how what was happening was even possible. After all, little Kim and his brother Mino were fighting as if they were equals. At one point, Kim lunged forward and managed to scratch Mino, wounding him for the first time. Mino refused to accept this and couldn't believe that this greenhorn was on the same level as him. Therefore, with his next move, Mayan summoned his skill, namely the Binding Spirit technique. Gavk was surprised that his brother had decided to use this technique against the child. In response, little Kim used his special Asura technique, its 3rd form. The collision of these 2 techniques threw Mayan back, and he couldn't believe he had seen the Asura technique. Nevertheless, Kim's technique was very similar to the 3rd form of the Binding Spirit. In the next moment, Kim jumped on him from above and shouted how he dared to insult his master. He remembered when he first started training with the general, and Vol told him that his stance had improved. Kim had already learned to block attacks, and Vol saw progress every day. After that, Vol said that he didn't think Kim was that kind of person, and the boy asked what he meant. Vol explained that when he first saw him, he was the most ill-mannered bully he had ever seen. So he was surprised that the boy was training so intensely. The boy explained that there was a reason for this, because it was his first time in such an environment. At first, he didn't even know who his real parents were, and the only thing he remembered about his childhood were the hellish days he spent in Diark's laboratory. He didn't want any of it. He didn't want to be born in Ichon. He didn't want to be Diark's test subject. And the whole world was just a place of contempt and hatred for him. However, one day he met Lee, who offered to take him with him. He praised him, was kind, didn't demand anything in return, and cared for the boy. And once he even called him his man instead of a pathetic brat. And that's why he became dear to him. Although he didn't tell Volya about it, thinking about Master Kim, he couldn't help but smile when he saw Volya. That's why, in the fight with Main, Kim shouted that he would send anyone who stood in his master's way to the other world. With the help of the Asur technique, the boy simply slashed Mayan badly. This wounded his opponent so badly that he even fell unconscious to the floor. Lee then realized that he had no idea that Kim admired him so much. And although Lee read his thoughts in the author's lines, he was touched, even though he had no idea that he was so strong. In the next moment, laser pointers from rifles appeared on Lee and Kim's skin. The military approached them and said that our heroes had almost destroyed one of the best students of Sword Mountain. These soldiers assumed that since that was the case, they weren't afraid to go to the other world themselves. Lee understood that these were soldiers from Sword Mountain, and if they used demonic bullets, he and Kim would be in great danger. That's why Lee warned Kim not to overdo it. At that moment, Gavk shouted loudly for the group of soldiers to lower their weapons. Gavk then stood in front of Lee, shielding him from the lasers with his chest, and the soldiers recognized him as Commander Gavk. After that, Commander Gavk shouted again at the soldiers to lower their weapons. In the end, they finally listened to him and lowered their rifles. Lee wanted to ask Gavk something, but Gavk replied that he would deal with them himself. Our hero did not know the exact situation, but he understood that nothing good would come of it if they became enemies with someone powerful. Judging by Gavk's reaction, he was definitely connected to the Mountain of Swords. Gavk then said that he had asked them to stop because he was afraid that they would get caught up in the mess his younger brother had created. The soldiers noted that Main was seriously injured, and Gavk replied that everyone knew what he was like and that it was bound to happen someday. He also pointed to Lee and said that, although he was young, he was already the head of the sect. Li Huan then introduced himself to them and said that he was one of the 7 unchanging sword strikes. Unlike Gavk, these soldiers had heard of his name and were surprised by him. One of them asked if our hero Li Huan was indeed the Eastern Dragon, and he confirmed it. After a while, he was flying with Gavk in a helicopter, and Gavk was surprised that Li was the man the master was looking for, and it was surprising to him that they had crossed paths with him at the hotel. Li was interested in why the head of Sword Mountain was looking for him, but Gavk did not know. He only assumed that since the master was looking for Li, they would be honored guests. For Li, all this was very strange because the author had not told him anything about it. And even though Lee assumed that he would end up on Sword Mountain because of the meeting at the hotel, he did not understand why the master was looking for him. After all, it was not obvious because he did not yet know that Lee was the heavenly demon of this era. Thinking about the plot, Lee hoped that the master would make it exciting, but if something went wrong, he had the ring. And so Lee simply decided to enjoy what was happening and thought about having a snack soon. Very soon, they landed at the headquarters of the 5th peak of Sword Mountain. There, they were given martial arts master clothing, which took Lee back to the past, which Kim asked him about. But Lee pretended he had misspoken and told Kim that he looked amazing. In addition, our hero felt that everyone around him was doing everything to please them. Lee suggested that Kim lie down on the bed and rest, because he had tried very hard to deal with Maine. Then he reminded Kim that he had said he would destroy anyone who stood in the way of his master, and Kim was wildly embarrassed by this. At that moment, Guak knocked on the door and asked if he could come in. He came in and apologized for disturbing Kim and Lee's rest, but he said he did it because the master wanted to meet with them. All this time, the master and his daughter had been watching them, and at one point he asked her how she liked Lee, and she replied that he was not bad. Then the master decided that now they could begin the test. Going out into the courtyard, Kim said that now he felt like he was really in the world of martial arts because of the clothes and traditions. Lee noted that the author was really good at creating detailed decorations. Guak led them to the pavilion and said they could wait for the master there. He added that this was a place for honored guests, and since Lee was the head of the sect, the master was expressing his respect in this way. After Guak led them there, he said he would leave them alone and that they would have to wait for the master inside. He added that the master would definitely come to them, and Lee and Kim sat down at a large round table. Lee was surprised that no one brought them any food, and Kim was also upset about this. Our hero asked Kim not to pay attention to this, as he was sure that someone would come soon. In addition, Lee suggested that Kim order their favorite soup, which they had eaten in a cafe before. Lee also thought that when the head of the swords came, he would finally be able to find out why he was looking for him. But time passed, and no one came, and little Kim fell asleep at the table, and the sun came out after the night. Lee was already sitting in a rage, ready to fight those who made him wait so long. Earlier that night, Guak had asked his master how they could treat Lee that way. After all, Lee was their guest and an Eastern dragon, and they couldn't treat him with such contempt. But Master Pakefell replied that he should not worry, for this was a test. He added that while Guak was on the southern front, several events had taken place, and in any case, if everything worked out, Lee would be the winner, and Guak asked what he meant. Pakefell sighed deeply and said that he would now explain everything to his protege. In the morning, Lee read this part of the chapter and was puzzled by it. He thought it was terrible, but overall, the author had thought the story through quite well. Nevertheless, because of the trial, Lee couldn't understand what was going on for a long time. He thought that they had shown him disrespect, but he couldn't do anything about it, even though they didn't know who he was yet. Nevertheless, their boldness in expressing disrespect annoyed him greatly. He thought that this would not work, and that he needed to prepare carefully to dominate, so he called on Leah. As soon as she appeared, she yelled at our hero. He had completely forgotten about her and hadn't spoken to her in a long time, which annoyed her, but Lee thought she must be hungry. She was angry with him and tried to hit him, but Lee told her not to waste her energy because she couldn't hurt him anyway. Then he asked her if she was hungry, and she said that Lee must think she was a pig. But Lee stopped her hysterics and asked if she could feel the yin energy. Kabalia concentrated and felt the energy deep underground. Lee explained that the Sword Mountain sect was luxurious, but it was a giant, unorthodox sect built on a pile of corpses. Lee asked if Leah could sense countless vengeful spirits underground, and she said that compared to hell, it was nothing. But for the earth, it was a lot. Lee realized that she couldn't just agree with him and said that he needed her help with this. Kabalia suggested that she would need to get rid of all the spirits underground. But Lee said she was wrong because evil spirits weren't the only creatures there. There was one legendary figure of Sword Mountain. This figure had attained Asura enlightenment and also a mystical level, and she still lived there. This mystical figure was called Ma Chun-he, and he was the grandfather of the current head of Sword Mountain. He had attained Asura enlightenment and a mystical level, but he couldn't handle his power and went mad, settling in a cave. Lee suggested that if Ma Chun-he was on his side, he could deal with anything that might happen in Sword Mountain. Lee asked Liu to bring him in 2 days, and in return, she could eat as many spirits as she wanted. She replied that it was better than staying in Lee's head, and that she would be interested in meeting such a person. But she was curious why he lived in a cave, and Lee replied that she would find out when she got there, and that it would not be so difficult to deal with him. It would be more difficult to solve his psychological problems. After some time, Lee woke Kim up and he jumped up in horror. He was afraid that he had overslept, but Lee said that he had had his first fight, and it was normal for him to be tired. Kim asked about the head of the Mountain of Swords, and Lee replied that he had not come to them. So Lee told the boy that they needed to leave the building to understand what was going on. When they left the building, they saw Paik feel Guak and several other people, and Lee asked them what it all meant. Paik Fella greeted him first and called him the Eastern Dragon. Lee replied that he was not in the mood to make new acquaintances, and that he needed to figure out why they had been made to wait so long at night. Paik asked them to follow him, and promised to explain everything on the way. Following him, Lee thought that he would have to play along until Leah returned. But in the next moment, Paik attacked our hero, who barely managed to dodge. Noticing that he had missed, Paik said that Lee was quite nimble. The next second, he drew his sword and asked what Lee would say about such a blow. Lee himself had no idea what was going on around him. The night before, Paik had told Guak that this test was designed to find a son-in-law for the master. The first test was to show whether he had enough patience. The master told his daughter that a gentleman never loses his composure, and a person who shows anger immediately finds himself at a low level, especially when they themselves realize what level they are at. Lee waited from 9 in the evening until 7 in the morning, and they could assume that he had successfully passed the first test. According to his daughter, the second test should be his martial arts skills. The master nodded and said that a strong man is able to prove his skills even in unexpected situations. His daughter noted that they would see how he behaved and whether he could stand up to the leader of the fifth peak. Lee stopped Paik's sword strike with one hand and asked what he was doing. Paik was shocked that Lee was able to stop his strike without a weapon in his hands. After that, he jumped back, and Lee told Kim not to come near them. Paik threw Lee a sword and challenged him to a fair duel. Paik then promised that Lee would soon learn the reason for their duel. Lee sighed and said that it all seemed like some kind of test. Lee then asked if his opponent should not be stronger than him. After all, it was illogical for the test subject to be stronger than the tester, which angered Paik. He said that he had originally intended to be a little gentler with Lee than he could have been, but our hero's arrogance towards him crossed all boundaries, and after that, a direct confrontation between Lee and Paik with swords began. It seemed as if they were roughly equal in skill, as neither had been able to injure the other. Guak, who was watching, couldn't believe what was happening before his eyes. Li Huan was on par with Master Paik, and although Guak had expected Lee to be strong, he hadn't expected him to be this strong. Guak also had a feeling of déjà vu. He had felt the same way when little Kim fought Main. Lee and Kim's technique was similar to the binding spirit technique of the Mountain of Swords. Paik felt the same way, and he realized that he wasn't paranoid because it seemed to him that Lee was using the technique of the connecting spirit. And so Paik decided that Lee was a thief and unworthy of being the master's son-in-law, and he shouted at Lee, asking where he had stolen and learned this technique. At that moment, Guak saw that Paik was using the intertwined swords technique. Our hero realized that he had to stop his opponent's movements. After all, Paik knew nothing about him, and he couldn't be blamed for saying that he had stolen the technique. But today, our hero was generous and decided to show him some of his real techniques. Lee used the uprising of the 6 demons to interrupt Paik's attack, and Paik was shocked that Li Huan managed to destroy the energy of his sword and technique. In the next moment, they clashed again in a sword fight. Paik began to study Lee's movements and realized that he was using the same movements he had used before. But despite this, they were different from the movements Paik made, and for some reason, Paik had the feeling that Lee was guiding him to a higher level of zenith. When Paik finally reached it, he was in 7th heaven. However, it did not last long because he was unable to overcome this level for 10 years. Then Paik reached his limit. Despite training every day, he felt that an invisible wall was blocking his path. He could not even overcome the initial level of the highest zenith, let alone reach the mystical level. And now he saw what he was missing in the movements of the stranger, Lee's sword. In them, Paik saw his path to reaching the next level of the highest zenith. But when Lee finished his strike, Paik lost consciousness from the blows and simply lay on the ground. Seeing his master unconscious on the floor, Guak couldn't believe his eyes. At that time, Kabalia had already descended into the caves and was eating evil spirits in search of the old man. She noted that this place was completely filled with evil spirits. Nevertheless, that was exactly why Kabalia liked this place so much. But she had to find Ma Chun-hei. She could feel his energy, but the place was so big that it was impossible to determine his location. The underground cave system was too large, but this did not bother her much, and she decided to continue on, because at least there was something to eat here. At that moment, at the headquarters of the Sword Mountain Master, Jung-ak was sitting and writing a letter. At one point, his daughter Yoha entered the office, and he was happy to see her. The master asked her if she had come to report the results of Li Huan's trials. She quietly replied that she had come for that, and said that Li had defeated the leader of the Fifth Peak. The master could not believe his ears, and said that they had finally found a man worthy of being her husband. Overjoyed, Jung-ak shouted that he must meet him as soon as possible, but Yeoha took off her hat and asked her father to let her meet Li first. Kim and Guak were standing outside the office of the leader of the Fifth Peak of the Mountain of Swords. In the office itself, Paik said that he had to thank Li because everything had taken an unexpected turn. Paik said that he had to test Li, but in the end, he himself received help, and even the master could not help him. But Paik was also interested in who Li was, and our hero repeated that he was Li Huan of the 7 unchanging sword strikes. The leader of the Fifth Peak said that this was not the best explanation, and that he should be grateful for the help in advancing to the next level. However, he had to find out one thing that he still did not understand. Paik asked him to answer how Li learned the technique of the binding spirit. Li realized that he shouldn't have helped Paik, because everything was becoming annoyingly complicated. Our hero was not like a petty villain who stole the technique, so he asked for a clear answer. Li decided not to lie, because the truth would only make the story more interesting. So he said that Paik was wrong. After all, it was not our hero, but the Sword Mountain sect itself that stole this technique. These words angered Paik, and he said that they treated him as an honored guest, but he was insulting them. At that moment, the daughter of the sect leader, Yoha, entered the leader's office and asked what was going on. She asked if she had heard correctly that Li had said that the Mountain of Swords had stolen the Binding Spirit's technology. Looking at Li coldly, she asked him to answer this question. Li saw her for the first time and admitted that she was beautiful and said that he was only stating the facts. She said that Li had first stolen the technique and now dared to lie to her face, and decided that he was definitely not worthy of being her husband. At that moment, Gavk was holding Kim, and Yoha asked to be allowed to change her question. She asked where and how Li Huan stole the technique of the binding spirit of the Mountain of Sword. Li repeated that he did not steal it, and said that he was simply using the Asura technique. He explained that this was the real name of the binding spirit technique, and that the Mountain of Swords had stolen it and renamed it. Yoha did not listen to his words because, in her opinion, Li continued to make up absurd lies. Running up to Li, she said that this was a good enough reason for Li to go to the other world. Our hero was very surprised that the girl was moving so fast. She immediately swung her sword to cut our hero in half. But to her surprise, Li then asked why everyone here was so impatient. He added that it was ridiculous because they suddenly started testing him in order to become his son-in-law, and then planned to destroy him. Li said that would never happen unless it was over his dead body. Yoha was completely confused by the fact that our hero had managed to stop her sword. Li repeated that the Asura technique was created by the great heavenly demon for the personal protection of the Asura squad, and now the Mountain of Swords had passed it on, and that was a fact. He suggested that the leader of the Fifth Peak did not know this, but it was strange that the heiress of the Mountain of Swords did not know about it. At that moment, in the cave system, Kabelia finally met Ma Chun-he. He heard her and asked who she was, since he had never met her before, and she was surprised that he had seen her. But Chun-he said that he could not help but see the radiation of such strong demonic energy, even though, according to his senses, she was neither alive nor dead. Leah said she didn't want to waste time arguing because she needed to talk to him anyway. She introduced herself as Kabelia, daughter of the Demon Empress Minstrel, and asked if he was Ma Chun-he. Leah also said that he would have to go with her, but Ma refused because he had no intention of leaving this place. She replied that she didn't care about his opinion because she had to get him out of there. Ma Chun-he shouted that Leah was a cheeky girl and she shouldn't talk to him like that. Suddenly, he changed a little and told him to shut up and stop talking nonsense. Then he shouted that it didn't matter how they got out of there. He began to argue loudly with himself, and Kabelia even had to cover her ears, realizing that he had truly gone mad. The only way to get him out of there was to enter his mind and suppress his madness. Leah couldn't imagine that she would have to enter someone else's mind, and she decided to beat Lee as soon as she was free from it. But after a couple of moments, she transformed herself to enter Chun-he's mind. Inside him, she saw the sane Chun-he fighting with the insane one. She assumed that his madness was caused by a split personality that was fighting itself. Then she realized that it would not be difficult because she only needed to help his normal personality. However, she suddenly noticed something she could not believe. On the surface, Li Huan continued to fight with the master's daughter. At one point, he pinned her against the wall and could have easily pierced her with his sword. However, Lee stuck his sword into the wall next to her head, which also angered her. Lee asked if she would come to her senses only after seeing the difference, because noticing the difference in strength and knowing when to retreat is also a skill. Neither Paik nor Guak could believe that Lee had defeated Lady Yoha so easily. Only Kim thought that he knew his master would definitely win. Yoha thought it was impossible, because Lee was at least at a transcendent level. She realized that he was probably even stronger than her father, the sect master. Then she yelled at him and asked why he was causing them so many problems, and Lee shouted that they were the ones who had caused him problems. First, they invited him and made him undergo trials, and then it turned out that these trials were to become the son-in-law of the head of Sword Mountain. On top of that, they accused our hero of theft, so he believed that he was only correcting their mistakes. Lee asked if he was right, but Yoha shouted that nothing would have happened if Lee hadn't stolen the binding spirit technique. Our hero continued to prove that he had not stolen it, and asked why Yoha did not understand that it was an Asura technique. At that moment, Lee felt a dozen armed guards standing behind him. He realized that he had crossed the line. Lee defeated the heiress of Sword Mountain on their own territory, and that was bad, even though he was just defending himself. But at that moment, he was surprised when Yoha shouted at the guards to stand down. The guards were confused because they believed they had to protect Yoha, but she asked them not to make her repeat her words at that moment. Turning to our hero, Lady Yoha said that it was pointless. After all, she had never heard of the existence of Asur techniques before. Lee realized that she was not lying to him, and if that was true, then someone was deliberately hiding this fact. Nevertheless, Yoha said that she believed it was unlikely that a master had reached a transcendent level at such a young age. He would not have lied so brazenly to the daughter of the master of Sword Mountain. Lee continued to think about who would benefit from hiding information about the Asur technique. At that moment, Yoha said she had to put down her sword and listen to Lee. After that, she told our hero that they should meet with the head of Sword Mountain. Lee didn't know that the master of Sword Mountain had been watching him on camera the whole time. As they walked towards the master, Kim suggested destroying everyone because they were too arrogant. Kim thought that they should not have dared to test Lee at all. Lee asked Kim if he really thought they should be destroyed, and Kim confirmed. A few moments later, he received a sword blow to the forehead from our hero. After that, Lee called Kim a complete fool, and Kim asked why. Lee explained that in order to seize power, two things were needed: skills and the perfect opportunity. Lee had already shown everyone his skills when he fought Paik and Yeho and defeated them. Now all he had to do was find the perfect opportunity to seize power. After all, if someone tried to seize control of the sect for no reason, they would have no choice but to shed blood. And that meant they would start a full-scale battle, and Lee would have to destroy his own army and his subordinates. Kim understood that Lee didn't need to be so cruel, but he was interested in whether there was another opportunity. After all, if Lee married the heiress, he would have a reason to subjugate the sect, and Lee said that this was ridiculous. Lee didn't understand how a wolf could simply obey a dog. And then Kim asked what case his master had in mind. Lee thought he would just show the Asura technique, but it didn't work out. But now Lee understood why there was something wrong with the author on the plane. First, Lee would have to meet with the head of the Mountain of Swords, but he had a bad feeling about it, and it was good that Lee was looking for Ma Chung-hei. When she brought him, and he confirmed Lee's identity, there would be no more problems. So Lee said that Kim would soon find out what his plan was. Soon, Lee was standing in a huge square in front of the sect master, and asked him what was going on. Lee didn't think this place was suitable for a conversation, so the master asked Lee for permission to ask him a question. He reminded Lee that he had said that the binding spirit technique originated from the Asura technique. Lee calmly replied that he did not take back his words. The master became nervous and clenched the arms of his chair, asking Lee what the Asura technique was. Lee began to explain that it was a technique created by the heavenly demons for the Asura squad of direct bodyguards. Lee himself replied that he was proof of his words, for he was the great heavenly demon of their time. The master shouted, "How dare Lee say such a thing?" For he had decided to listen to him because he had achieved so much at such a young age. But the master of the Mountain of Swords realized that Lee was simply a madman. He was ashamed to think of Lee as a man who could be his son-in-law, and the master said that he would cut him to pieces right then and there. However, he promised his daughter that he would grant her request and give Lee a chance to prove his words. After that, the master stood up abruptly and shouted at the people to take their positions. Suddenly, 8 people stood around our hero. Looking closely at them, Lee realized that they were the 8 leaders of the Mountain of Swords. The formation of 8 moons, one of the best formations in the world of martial arts, was added to the world. It was so powerful that even a master of the mystical level could not break through it. Lee could not believe that it was so complex, and the master said that he would recognize him if he could break through the formation. Lee did not expect this, because he was now at the beginning of the transcendental level, and could not overcome this formation in any way. Yoha cried out that it was impossible, and that even masters who were heads of sects would find it difficult to overcome this formation. She realized that his father had actually driven him into a deadly trap, and his father replied that this was indeed the case. He said that no matter how outstanding his achievements and character were, there was no reason to keep a deceitful thief alive. After that, the master asked his daughter not to tell him that she still liked Lee. Hearing these words from her father, Yoha's face flushed, and she turned away in embarrassment. And the master shouted again that Lee was a pathetic thief who had now stolen his daughter's heart. And in the next moment, he shouted for Lee to taste the formation of 8 moons. And before 8 people attacked him, time around him stopped. At that moment, Mr. Author appeared and said that he and Lee needed to talk. At that moment, Lee saw that behind her, a whole bunch of Ma Chin-hei personalities were fighting, not just 2. She realized that it was not surprising that this man had gone mad. In any case, she wondered whether she should use the power that Lee had given her. She remembered their conversation, in which Lee hinted that she would have to solve the problem of Ma Chun-hei with her head. Then she asked him what that meant, and Lee replied that those who had attained enlightenment as asuras had no choice but to obey Lee. After all, he was a heavenly demon. And then he suggested that Leah look at herself, because she was his subordinate. Then Leah thought that our hero was just mocking her again. But he replied that this was not the case, and that as long as she was in Ma Chung-hei's consciousness, she would have the advantage. After all, she would be able to borrow our hero's power from within him. She would be able to use the power that only those who have attained Asura enlightenment can wield. And then Kabelia would have no problem dealing with Ma Chun-he. Remembering this, Leah decided to give the order that everyone except the real Ma Chun-he should disappear. Surprisingly, it worked, and all the copies suddenly vanished, leaving only one personality. At that moment, the old man woke up and couldn't believe that he was able to wake up. Then, Kabelia told him that they needed to go to his master. Upstairs, Lee greeted the author and said that they hadn't seen each other in a long time. The author asked if our hero thought that everything would be all right with him, and Lee asked what he was talking about. Mr. Author said that he was talking about the formation of 8 moons, because with Lee's current level, he couldn't overcome it and would simply perish from it. Lee didn't understand why the author was so worried if he had come up with it all himself, and he replied that he didn't know it would come to this. He had simply created a powerful formation, suitable for Sword Mountain, but he didn't think the chapter would use it against Lee. Lee said that nothing could be done about it now, and there was no point crying over spilt milk. Then the author suggested that Lee use the Ring of Promise and return with him to the past. He suggested returning to the moment when they first arrived at the Mountain of Swords, and Lee asked if the master was serious. The author said that he had given him the ring in case of danger, and suggested that he use it now. But after listening to the author, our hero decided not to do so. The author said that it was similar to the situation with Tromos, and that Lee would most likely die. But Lee said that these were 2 different stories, because Tromos appeared out of nowhere in the story. But in the plot, enough events had happened for the formation of the 8 moons to appear. In addition, the reward was quite worthy, because then he would be recognized as a great demon. In addition to this, he would gain a sect that had previously looked down on him. As a bonus to the sect, Lee would get the heiress as his wife, which was also quite important. The author acknowledged that this was all interesting and wonderful, but he reminded Lee that he had forgotten something. After all, if the main character went to the other world, everything would end. As a result, Lee would have to return home, and the author would have to finish the story. And he didn't want to be a writer who ruined his main character again, because he couldn't handle the plot. At that moment, Lee put his hand on the author's shoulder and told him that there was a saying. This saying stated that in order to write an interesting novel, sometimes you have to risk your life. Lee added that if the story becomes interesting, it is best to leave everything as it is. And even if it is difficult, it is necessary. And the author said that it was easy for Lee to say that, because if the author did not fix it, he would die. Lee replied that the author would manage, and that they just needed to add some details to the background. These details would allow the protagonist to resolve difficulties that he would never have been able to overcome. The author clutched his head and repeated that he had nothing to add and couldn't think of anything. Lee then approached him and began to dictate his plan into his ear. He listed the specific details that the author needed to change in order to solve the problem. The author added all these notes to the lore and said that he would leave the rest to Lee and do what he had told him. After finishing the last changes, the author asked Lee if he was ready to carry out the plan. Our hero nodded, and then the author snapped his fingers and started the timer. Immediately, the masters of the 8 peaks began to approach him, and the master of the Mountain of Swords shouted for them to tear Lee apart. At that moment, Kim shouted, realizing that his master was in danger. A combined attack formation is a formation created so that several people can deal with a strong opponent. And although one might think that it would be more effective if several people attacked one person, however, this was far from the true order of things. The more people there were, the more the allies became a serious obstacle than the enemy. They get in each other's way, and the order of attacks becomes disorderly, which makes it difficult to fight. And if the people who have joined together in a formation do not act together, they end up losing. That is why it was necessary to use a combined attack formation. The 8 Moons Mountain Sword formation was created to deal with only one strong enemy. To do this, you need a team of 8 people, which is not too many and not too few. In addition, it was necessary to exert precise and systematic pressure on the enemy. Watching Li Huan's fight, Master Jungak reasoned that he did not think Li would hold up so well. But as he expected, our hero was too busy blocking attacks. And the important principle of this formation is to attack when the enemy is distracted. And it was obvious that any master would inevitably be distracted. And because of the countless attacks, the opponents would inevitably use this to attack again. But so far, to everyone's surprise, Li managed to avoid injury. The master understood that the stronger the attacks, the greater the recoil, and the more distracted the opponent would be. And showing weakness in the face of constant attacks that were delivered without a single mistake meant death. The 8 Moon formation limited the enemy's use of basic techniques. But according to Janga, this was exactly what was needed to destroy the formation. It was vital for Li to use very strong techniques to break free. He understood that if he continued to defend himself like this, he would have no chance of winning. And even though he could defend himself, 8 people were attacking him at once. It was obvious that our hero would be the first to lose his stamina, and if he got distracted, they would kill him. He had no choice but to use complex techniques with high returns. In order to survive and show his superiority, he would have to deal with these warriors. They possessed levels ranging from the highest zenith to the transcendent, and they had to be defeated with a single attack. Now Li understood why even masters of a mystical level found it difficult to defeat this formation. However, Li added some plot details to the story to overcome it, and he just needed to hold on a little longer. Gavk watched the battle and thought it was difficult to follow Li's movements. And since our hero was only 20 years old, Gavk assumed that he was indeed a heavenly demon. At the same time, he noticed that Kim was completely focused and therefore silent. He watched the battle, which even Gav couldn't keep track of, and saw every move. Looking at Li and Kim, Gav couldn't understand what other abilities they might have. Fighting off Li's constant attacks, Li realized that he was already getting tired. He knew he hadn't slept enough, but they were forcing him to fight since the previous day, and it was too cruel. At that moment, our hero felt that something was wrong with him, and that he had been wounded. Master Zhonggak also saw this, and ordered the warriors to quickly send Li to the other world. The Spearmasters immediately pounced on him furiously, and continued to strike him. However, they could not have expected that Li was waiting for this very moment. The background story of the formation was added to the lore, and it was developed by one of the heavenly demons for future heavenly demons. Using the initial movement of the formation, it was possible to destroy it and release the tiger from the 12 pressure points technique. Then Li managed to activate the 12 pressure points of the heavenly demon tiger and gain inexhaustible internal energy. Everyone around him thought that what Li did was impossible when they saw his internal energy. But at the same time, our hero was able to move on to the next mystical level. After that, Li already had access to the first technique of the great heavenly demon and the divine martial art of the heavenly demon. And with it, our hero activated his 7th form, summoning a lot of energy. With these movements, Li activated the fist that sent the dragon to the other world. This blow caused a pillar of dust to rise above the area where the formation had been created. When it began to settle, people saw Pegfila standing on his feet, but after a few moments he fell, and it became clear that Li had emerged victorious. Zhonggak couldn't believe that our hero had managed to destroy the formation, and where it had been, there was now a huge crater, and the masters were lying on the ground. Nevertheless, this fight was quite difficult for Li, and soon he also lost consciousness. After some time, he woke up bandaged in a room on a bed. Li couldn't understand where he was when he had lost consciousness, or how long he had been lying there. He was happy that he had reached a mystical level, but he had used up all his internal energy and suffered serious injuries. Now he would not be able to fight for some time, and besides that, he needed to regain his energy. The next moment, the master entered the room where he was with Yeho and the guard. Li also noticed that they were armed. Li thought that Jungak would recognize him if he destroyed the formation of the 8 moons, but now it seemed like a lie. Besides, Li didn't know what to do next because he couldn't fight. But all his worries vanished when Jungak shouted that they were welcoming the heavenly demon. He bowed and said that he had come as soon as he was sure that Lee was conscious, and apologized for the absence of one leader who was recovering. There, our hero noticed Ma Chun-hei, who also welcomed the heavenly demon. Lee was incredibly happy to see him, and realized that Lee had managed to bring him there. Ma Chun-hei said that he had heard that his grandson had been very rude to Lee, but he hoped that Lee would forgive him with his generous heart. Lee thought that Kabelia had brought Ma Chung-hei at the right time, and that he had probably already explained everything to the head of the sect. Kim appeared at that moment, worried that the master had been unconscious for 3 days, and Lee called him a good boy. Ma Chung-hei then told Jungkook to apologize properly to Lee. He asked for his deepest apologies for his disrespect and thanked Lee for bringing his grandfather. Mu Chung-hai added that the origin of the Mountain of Swords was a group of asuras loyal to the great heavenly demons, and Chung-hei realized that while he was away, the story of the Mountain of Swords and the origin of the binding spirit technique had been lost. But Lee told everyone that everything was fine, and they had resolved all the problems. Ma Chung-hei then asked Lee not to address him formally, because no boss does that with his subordinates. In any case, Lee thought it was good that they didn't have to discuss the details, and he was still wondering if Chunha had any doubts about him. After all, even if Leah had explained everything to him, it wasn't so easy to believe that he was a heavenly demon. Chunhei thought that Lee was testing him, and reminded him that he had attained the state of enlightenment of an asura, and now it was impossible for him not to recognize a heavenly demon. Lee was incredibly excited that all the stories were falling into place, like pieces of a puzzle. 4 days later, Jungkook asked why Lee was leaving so soon, since he needed rest. But Lee replied that it was about him, and that a week was enough. Then Jongga felt embarrassed, and asked if it would be shameless of him to ask the heavenly demon something. Jongga was interested in how things would turn out with the marriage between Lee and his daughter. Lee replied that now was not the right time, because since ancient times, it had been believed that a person should have great ambitions. And although our hero now had the Sword Mountain sect at his disposal, for him it was only the beginning, and he had no time for love. Therefore, Lee hoped that they would treat this with understanding, and they agreed. But Lee saw how upset Yoha was, and told her that when his great goal was achieved, and if her feelings remained the same and did not disappear. Then he promised that he would definitely return to her one day and marry her. When Kim heard this, the words about marriage made him sick, but Lee said that he had said a beautiful phrase. In the end, our hero said that a lot had happened during that time, but in the end, he decided it was time to go home. And as he left, Lee asked them to take care of Sword Mountain until he returned. And our hero and Kim walked away to the enthusiastic cheers of the crowd who wished the heavenly demon good health. Happy that everything had ended successfully, Lee suggested that Kim finally return to Korea. During the flight, Lee Shin read the news that the Eastern Dragon had conquered the Central Plains and that he was Korea's new hope. At the airport, a crowd chanting his name was already waiting for his flight. After getting off the plane, Lee felt exhausted, even though he had flown first class. While he was thinking about how exhausting flying was, he noticed that everyone at the airport was looking at him. Lee asked Kim if he was becoming paranoid, and if it was true that everyone was looking at them. Kim showed him the news, which said that he had become the leader of the Mountain of Swords. Opening the door to the street, our hero couldn't understand how they had found out. When he and Kim went outside, a crowd of reporters and paparazzi was waiting for them. They all asked our hero questions about the Mountain of Swords sect and his role in it. Looking for some way to escape, Lee noticed Shin standing behind the crowd. She nodded her head, and our hero realized that she had a plan to get them out of there. A little while later, they were driving in her car, and Lee thanked her for her help. Shin said that he was under the protection of the Bureau. Shin said that, as they had already noticed at the airport, they had leeches attached to them, and she was worried about them, so she went to pick them up. But she was interested in whether our hero had really captured the Mountain of Sword, because they had to make an official statement about it. Lee had to maintain the image of a weak but strong character, and he couldn't tell her the truth, so he denied everything. He asked them to forget the details, and announced that Lee had become the successor to the Mountain of Swords sect. They laughed at the circumstance, and Lee said he wouldn't mind if she drove them home. The only thing Lee wanted was for her not to offer him a position as a civil servant. After that, our hero noticed that it was raining outside, and then he wanted to eat something special, and also wanted to treat the generals to a meal. Lee told Kim that they would eat something more interesting than the usual gukbap. He then asked Shin to stop by the market, and she agreed to do so. Finally, they arrived at the house, and Lee thanked Shin for giving them a ride. In response, Shin asked to be contacted if Lee needed anything, and warned that they would announce what Lee wanted. Back home, Il tried the new dish for the first time and said it was simply amazing. The three of them sat on the floor and devoured the delicious food, washing it down with tasty drinks. Il still couldn't believe that our hero had become the Lord of Sword Mountain and congratulated him on it. Lee said it wasn't difficult, and Kim added that he thought the master would die in that battle. But our hero said that in any case, he was sorry that Vol couldn't celebrate with them, and Il said that he had to return to heaven. Nevertheless, he promised to return to them soon. The next moment, Lee said he hoped Vol would return soon, and then time stopped. At that moment, Lee heard the author's joyful voice behind him. He was holding a large cream cake with 3 candles on top. Our hero wondered what the cake was for, and what the author was congratulating him on. The author congratulated him on their novel taking 3rd place, and Lee was shocked by this. Mr. Author himself couldn't believe his words, and praised Li Huan because they had taken 3rd place right after the new chapter. And now they were very close to 1st place, and the author enjoyed reading nothing but good comments. The author continued to praise Lee, and Lee couldn't believe that the author would ever say such a thing to him. The author couldn't understand why Lee wasn't happy with it, and Lee replied that it was too early to relax. After all, he hadn't started his revenge yet, and the Heavenly Demon Sect had only signaled its revival, and it was impossible to relax after taking 3rd place, because if you relaxed, the readability level would decrease, and the rating would drop. But in any case, Lee was sure that they needed to celebrate their achievement, and Lee threw a cake in the author's face. After that, smiling and laughing, the author ran after Lee and promised to punish him for it. Running away from the author, Lee told him that he still congratulated him on 3rd place, and he couldn't wait for their future adventures together.